This is such a quiet group. So good evening. I'm Jean Eddy, Chief Operating Officer at RISD, and it is my pleasure to welcome honored guests, members of the Providence community, and of course, RISD students, faculty, and staff to this very important evening, one that I have been preparing for 9 months. Many of us remember the winter of 2015 here in Alaska, Rhode Island, where we canceled, and then we canceled again, an evening with Tim Wise. Despite reports over the weekend of possible flurries today, I am pleased to be standing here before you as we begin this year's series of lectures, programs, and workshops that will provide us with meaningful moments of service, reflection, self-development, inspiration, and celebration. Historically, each January, RISD's Diversity Committee organizes and executes a comprehensive program of special events to affirm and celebrate our commitment to inclusion, community, and the exploration of the many worlds that come together on our campus. And each year, we dedicate special time to acknowledge the life and contribution of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. through music, artistry, days of service, conversations, and evenings with individuals who make us think and make us question. Last January, despite the weather, we had 9 days to come together in this special way. When we concluded, it was clear that we have much more to say and much more to share. This evening begins a year-long series of events and represents an exciting collaboration between the MLK Series and the RISD Leads program, broadening our opportunities to meet, network with, and learn from notable individuals. Students will hear firsthand from leaders across disciplines and start to formulate their own leadership style. Our community will have a variety of backdrops to have conversations about our sense of inclusion and how we embrace difference. Ideally, as this year's program closes, we will be more aware, more connected as a community, and identify a little bit of ourselves that perhaps we didn't know about. Tonight's speaker will start this year's conversation. He will be introduced by a young woman who joins other student leaders on campus to make their mark on these conversations and interactions. Lucy Crelly is a junior in apparel design and is a Leadership and Community Engagement Fellow. She is already someone who is standing out as a leader at RISD for her work in the Global Initiative, eShip in Residence, Student Title IX Representative, and she is one of the co-founders and co-presidents of SHARE. So please help me welcome Lucy to the podium.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jean, for the introduction. So as Jean mentioned, I work as a leader with a few student groups on campus, and in doing that, it becomes increasingly clear that leadership is ineffective without addressing all the varying levels of privilege here. So as artists and designers working to be the change makers of the future, this is a great opportunity for us to listen to Tim and to become well-versed in identifying and even the most subtle of inequalities. Before I introduce Tim, there's a few housekeeping things. There's a few fire exits in this building. There's 1, 2, 3 up there. There's 2 right there, and there's 2 behind me. In case of emergency, that's where they are. And also, after this speech, Tim will be doing book signing, but he's unfortunately run out of copies of his book. So if you have any of your own or anything you want him to sign, he will be here on stage afterwards. Okay, so Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. Named one of 25 visionaries who are changing our world, Wise has spoken internationally as well in all 50 states, on over 800 college and high school campuses, and to community groups across the nation. Wise is the author of 7 books, including his latest titled Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Jeopardizing the Future of America, as well as his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Wise has contributed essays to 25 books, received the 2001 British Diversity Award for Best Feature Essay on Race Issues, and has contributed to dozens of popular, professional, and scholarly journals. In the early 90s, he was youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, the largest of the many groups organized for the purpose of defeating neo-Nazi political candidate David Duke. From 1999 to 2003, Wise was an advisor to the Fisk University Race Relations Institute in Nashville. In 2001, Wise trained journalists to eliminate racial bias in reporting as a visiting faculty in residence at the Poitner Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida. In the summer of 2005, Wise served as an adjunct faculty member at the Smith College School for Social Work in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he co-taught a master's level class on racism in the U.S. Wise has been featured in several documentaries, including a 2011 public dialogue with legendary scholar and activist and RISD's 2012 MLK Series Keynote speaker Angela Davis, entitled Vocabulary of Change. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs, is a regular contributor to race discussions about race on CNN, and has been featured on ABC's 2020. Wise has proved anti-racism guidance to teachers nationwide, has conducted training with physicians and medical industry professionals on how to combat racial inequalities in healthcare, and has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, military, and law enforcement officials on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Tim has even served as a consultant for plaintiffs' attorneys in federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington State. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. For more information and to purchase Tim's books, please visit timwise.org. So now please join me in welcoming Tim Wise.
First of all, thank you. I'm really sorry for that ridiculously long bio. I totally wrote that, so it's like I was applying for a job at your institution and I just wanted to impress you with all the stuff that I had done. Not that any of that really matters, and it's not really why you're here. I assume that you are here because the issues that are mentioned on the posters about my presentation, plus the issues that are by definition raised in the process of an MLK program series, which you're going to obviously be indulging over the course of the year, are issues that are important to you. And so none of that biographical stuff really matters. I either know what I'm talking about or I don't, and you will have an hour roughly to determine the answer to that question. I intend to dazzle you with all the brilliance that I can, but none of that stuff is really the key, because the truth of the matter is, and I want to say this up front, as a matter of both, I think, moral responsibility and practical responsibility, and as a matter of accountability as a white person doing anti-racism work in a society where it is certainly not my people who are the target of the problem, that most of the wisdom that I have about this subject did not come in the classroom. It was not imparted to me by people with PhDs, in spite of how valuable those individuals can be every now and then. It was not the result of reading large, voluminous books written by people who had studied the subject academically for, decades and written those volumes. Most of what I know about racism and intend to impart to you was actually passed along to me by people whom we as a society really don't value very much in terms of their wisdom and their insight. That is to say, most of it was passed along to me, not only by people of color generally, but low-income folk of color in particular. People with whom I worked for about a year and a half, 15 months or so, in public housing in the city of New Orleans, where I lived for 10 years in that city, and with whom I worked for that year and a quarter to a year and a half. People who taught me more about issues of race and class and economic and racial inequality than any of the folks that I ever took a class from in college. And that's not to denigrate the wisdom of those scholars. It's just to say that sometimes wisdom comes in packages that you don't expect. And so I'm very glad you're here to listen to me. Like I said, I intend to dazzle you, and I'm fairly confident I'll do that because I'm reasonably good at the shit that I do. But really, the real mark of our progress as a people, as a society on these issues, will be when we can listen not just to me And not just to people of color who are, you know, reputed scholars either, because although that's really important, even that's not enough. Like, it's not enough to listen to Angela Davis, in spite of how much I love Sister Angela and how much I love many scholars of color around the country. The fact is, and she would tell you this too, that the people at the grassroots level, at the local level, people who work on these issues every day in places like Providence and who fight issues of housing discrimination, police brutality, racial profiling, healthcare inequality, right? Those are the real people that we need to be following and that we need to be listening to and learning from. Certainly as much as we do people like myself. So I'm glad you're here. I intend to give you some information that you can use, but really and truly, let's get to a place, I hope, sooner rather than later, where we can hear these kinds of subjects spoken about by people who don't fit this aesthetic and who don't necessarily have scholarly credentials behind them and 7 books and all of this other nonsense that really at the end of the day doesn't matter. And I say that even though I really totally want you to buy all 7 of my books. I think you should, because they're really good. But, like, you know, you should buy other books as well, and not just mine, the books written by people of color, and even listen to those people who have never had a book published, not because they have nothing to say, but because sometimes they're presumed not to. It is especially good to be here after, as you heard, the drama of the weather last year, which I need not tell you, you know, the drama of the weather. Although I do have to own the first one of those myself. Like, that wasn't actually your fault. The blizzard, that's on you. Like, you got to deal with that. But the first time was actually weather in my part of the world. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and we had bad weather, and that sort of screwed me up, and I wasn't able to get here. I'm glad that the third time was the charm. If it had snowed me out this time, I was pretty much done with you guys. I was going to take it as karma and just never going to come. Like, I was done, never, ever going to drop in. But luckily it worked out, and I'm glad to be here. This is the 20th fall, actually the 21st fall, 20 full calendar years, but the 21st fall that I've been on the road in some capacity talking about issues of race. And whenever you do something for, you know, roughly 2 decades, right, there is a tendency, and I think it's reasonable, to start doing a little bit of a retrospective, right, and thinking about what has changed in that 20 years. And really, I've been doing anti-racism and civil rights work in some capacity for 25. So let's say a quarter century, right? Over a quarter century of work, what has changed and what hasn't? What's different and what's the same? It's a natural instinct, and it's actually a worthwhile sort of jumping off point for the evening's discussion, because a lot of things have changed and a lot of things haven't. And it's probably worth tallying up both sides of that ledger and sort of figuring out what they mean for us in 2015 and what they mean for us as we try to move forward as a people, as a society, as a country, as a world. On the one hand, I think we can say without fear of contradiction that in 2015, as opposed to, let's say, 1995 or 1990 when I started this work, 95 on the road, 1990 in some professional sense, it is probably safe to say that we are more intensely focused right now in terms of the news and, you know, sort of the news cycle and the political cycle on issues of race and racial inequality than would have been true then. Now, that's not to say that we're more focused in a positive, constructive way. It's just to say that race issues are probably more prominent in the news right now, whether it's because of various law enforcement disparities that have bubbled up to the surface of public consciousness in that period of time, or whether it's the backlash against immigration, right? But only certain immigrants, I should point out, not all immigrants, just the ones from south of this artificial border that was created as the result of a war of aggression that our country started on false pretense. I know that's not what they taught you in 8th grade history class, but trust me when I tell you that's what actually happened. Right? We only worry about those immigrants. We're not worried about, like, the Minutemen never camp out on the Canadian border, right? Like, they never worry about sneaky Canadians trying to come in and take advantage of our superior healthcare system. Because that would be insane, right? Why would they do that? The Minutemen never camp out in little dinghies off the coast of Nova Scotia with guns, like looking for sneaky Canadians who are trying to come in and take advantage of all our great free stuff, right? But we only worry about brown folk coming over one border, so that's, and we'll talk about that more later as the night goes on, but that's one of those things that we're focused on now in a way that maybe 20 years ago, not so much. A lot of this, of course, is post-2008, where after the election of a man of color as president for the first time, the nation's attention was riveted to issues of race, not always in a constructive way, oftentimes in a very regressive and reactionary way, right? Sort of all of a sudden heightening white anxiety at the election of a man of color with an exotic name from Hawaii, oh my God, or Kenya, right? Either one, exotic, right? Hawaii for a lot of white people is like a tourist destination, so we don't even understand how that's a real state, right? So people look at him as sort of this, and then they would say, did they not? And I'm sure you heard this, I certainly did. This idea that because of the election of a man of color, we'd have to talk about this anymore. Like these kinds of events, these discussions, right, needed to be relegated to the ash bin of history, because why would we need to talk about racism anymore in a country where a man of color could be elected president? Why talk about white privilege and issues of institutional inequity in a society where a man of color could be elected president? Because obviously in such a place as that, there couldn't be any racism, there couldn't be any privilege. I actually got an email from a guy like the day after the election in 2008, and I knew it was going to be insane because it was all capital letters. And it was red font. Let me just give you a bit of advice right now. Like if I piss you off tonight, and that is entirely possible, by the way, but if I piss you off and you need to write me for some reason, just take the cap lock off, sweetheart. It's fine. I'll read that, right? You send me all capital letters in red font, I'm just going to delete it. So like if you actually want me to hear your rant, just take the cap lock off, use black. It'll be fine. This guy writes to me, and he says, I guess you're going to have to find a new hustle now. Right, because Barack Obama had been elected, and that's all this is a hustle, right? Because when I was 22, I remember sitting around very distinctively at the end of my college career thinking to myself, what in the hell am I going to do with my life? What's my hustle going to be? I got to come up with a hustle. We all need a hustle. What's mine? Oh, I know. I'm going to fight white supremacy. Because that shit always works out well for everybody who does it. Like, no drawbacks there, no drama. It's all easy downhill sailing, right? Or that's mixed metaphors, you know what I mean? Downhill skiing, you know, sailing. I don't know. I'm from the South. What do I know about skiing or sailing? But you know what I mean, right? So this guy was telling me, in effect, that we'd have to talk about this anymore and that people like me who do civil rights work should just retire because obviously we couldn't have a racism problem in a country that would elect a man of color as president. And he asked me how I might explain the continued relevance of this discussion in such a place as the United States after 2008. And I told him then, and I'll tell you now the same thing, right? That ultimately it's no different than were we to believe somehow that sexism and patriarchy had been eliminated in Pakistan. Why? Because Benazir Bhutto, a woman after all, was elected not just once but twice in that country as the head of state. Now, keep in mind, she's been assassinated since, so that lets you know how much some people loved her. But she was elected. We still haven't elected a woman, so I assume every woman in here now instinctively knows that your odds are better in Karachi than in Providence. My guess is you wouldn't probably believe me if I were to say that. If I were to tell you that patriarchy had been smashed in Pakistan or Israel or India or Great Britain or the Philippines or Ireland, all of which have had female heads of state, where we still have not, you would probably immediately recoil from the suggestion because you would all know, certainly the women in this room, and I would guess even some of the guys would know, like, just because an individual from an otherwise marginalized group has somehow been elevated to the head of state doesn't tell us much about the larger reality facing millions of people from that same group. When we talk about it in that regard in other countries with regard to sex and gender, we know that. When we talk about it with regard to race in our own country, we're being led to believe that somehow we needn't discuss it. So in some regards, since the election of Barack Obama, there has been this intensified attention to race, not all of it positive, once again, oftentimes very reactionary, as with those who insist that they want to take their country back because suddenly it has been hijacked from them. I mean, imagine that language, right, and what it tells us about white America and its sense of entitlement, right? When a president of color is elected and spends money on things far less, actually, than his predecessor did. And all of a sudden, he's accused of stealing the country, hijacking the country, and these older white folks, God love them, get out in the streets, I want my country back, bro. And we're supposed to indulge that because these are white folks who actually have been led to believe it's our country, right? That's a sense of entitlement, a sense of ownership, right? A sense that says that America's a white place and how dare these people try to steal it from us, whether it's the president of color, whether it's a popular culture, increasingly multicultural, or whether it's a demographic shift that we're all aware of, I assume, right? Where in about 30 years from now, half the country will be people of color and half will be white, and a lot of folks are freaked out by that, right? So our attention is being riveted, not always in a good way, but certainly being riveted. That has changed in the last 20 years. And we'll talk more about just how much in a few seconds. But on the other hand, a lot of things that were true in 1995, or for that matter, probably 1985, 1975, 1965, or even beyond, aren't that different. And we're sometimes reluctant to acknowledge that. We like to talk about our progress and how much different and how much better we are relative to previous generations. We're not as good about talking about the sameness. But I would suggest to you that in a lot of ways, we are no different than we were 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, because in every generation, at every stop along the way, the dominant group, those of us called white, have been largely reluctant to acknowledge the extent of the problem of racism. It's been an intergenerational phenomenon, this thing called white denial, right? This intergenerational thing, year in and year out, generation in and generation out. Here's how I know this is true. So this isn't just hyperbole, and I'm not just like, speaking out of my ass. This is real stuff, right? So go back to the early 60s. Because see, it's one thing to believe that racism is not a problem in 2015. You almost can understand that. Right? Because particularly if you're a young person and you sort of look around and you compare the current day to that old black and white grainy footage from Selma in 1965 or Birmingham in 63, where it was just day-to-day brutality, right? By comparison, maybe it doesn't seem so bad. So I sort of get it. The problem is that even in the early 60s, white folks didn't get it, even when it was blatant. So the Gallup polls in 1963, a year before the Civil Rights Act was even passed, 2 years before the Voting Rights Act, 5 years before the Fair Housing Act, we were still an apartheid country. We were a system of formal white supremacy, a system of formal racial fascism. I know we don't like to use that kind of language because it's honest and we don't believe in that, right? But in 1963, at a time when we were still that place, Gallup went out and asked white Americans, do you think racial minorities are treated equally in your community? And in 1963, this is a really easy-ass question now, right? Half a century later, it's like, no, of course not, right? Nobody, regardless of your politics, is going to dispute that. No one in this room is going to go, no, I think it was all good in 63. Like, you're all clear on that. Hell, the Klan is clear on that, right? The Klan is clear that it wasn't equal, and by God, they preferred it that way. Like, they would be like, hell no, it wasn't equal, and I like it that way, right? So 1963, we all know in retrospect how profoundly, disturbingly unequal it was. But in 1963, when white Americans from around the country were asked the question, 2 out of 3 of us said, sure, everything's fine. 1962, they asked white folks, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? 87 out of 100 said yes. Really? You think? In 1962, you think that black kids in 1962 had the same chance at a good education? See, I would say that even in 2015, that's an absurd statement, right? Because we know that black and Latino students are 10 times more likely than white students to attend concentrated poverty schools. They're half as likely to have the most experienced teachers, twice as likely to have the least experienced teachers, half as likely to have access to honors and advanced placement classes, 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, even though they do not break the rules at a rate that is statistically significantly greater than white students. That's today. So to say that students of color have equal access to high-quality education even today would be absurd, but in 62, come on, this is not rocket science, this is easy. And yet almost 9 out of 10 white folks were like, oh yeah, I think it's all good. Pretty sure it's all good. Racism? What? Discrimination? What? I don't know what you mean. This is America. Everything's lovely. Leave It to Beaver is on. And the Andy Griffith Show. And my goodness. And everything is love. And we have, hula hoops and bobby socks or whatever the hell they had. That might have been the 50s. I don't know. I'm too young for that too, but you know what I mean, right? There was this sort of innocence, this naivete, this sense that everything was fine. And white Americans really believe that. So ask yourself, what does that mean, right? That white Americans, even when it was obvious, didn't see it. Because, you know, at least now you can sort of say, well, it's more subtle, it's not always as blatant, so you could miss it. Yeah, I get it. But in '63, come on, this was impossible to miss. It was on the TV every night. And for those of you who were used to like modern technology, remember, there were only 3 TV stations in 1963. Right now you got 300 stations, you got Netflix, you got video games, you got all kinds of shit. You don't have to pay attention to the news. In 1963, there were 3 stations. They all went off at midnight to the Star Spangled Banner, and then it was static for like 7 hours, right? So everybody was riveted, and then it went off, and you just went to bed because it was '63 and there was nothing else to do, right? You just went to sleep. Like some of us remember these days. I don't remember '63, but it was still that way up till about '81, you know? You just went to bed, because what the hell, it was midnight. What's on? Nothing. Go to sleep. Nothing, right? Everybody was watching it. 2 years ago when Bruno Mars did the halftime show at the Super Bowl and everybody freaked out. Oh my God, 120 million people were watching Bruno Mars. That's amazing. No, it's not. 125 million watched the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in 1964 at a much smaller country, right? Which means that everybody was focused on the news, on the television. They're all sitting around watching that idiot box night after night after night after night. And yet apparently 2 out of 3 white folks, or 87 out of 100, depending on which poll we're talking about, were looking at the news and going, I don't get it. Why are these black people so angry? Why are they marching on Washington? Why is that guy having a dream? I don't understand. I don't get it. My God, do you understand this? No, I don't understand this, right? So white folks have always been in denial, and you have to sort of ask yourself, what does that mean, right? What does it mean that a people can be in such denial about a problem even when it's obvious? Because there are only sort of 2 possible explanations, right? One is that white folks are just unfeeling, uncaring, horrible, hard-hearted people who were incapable of seeing the truth. But I doubt that, because I've been white a really long time. I've been white a really long time, right? And I've known plenty of people like that, but I don't believe for 1 minute that that's the norm, right? That most white folks are just horrible people. I think most people are good people, white, black, brown, whatever, right? I think most people are pretty decent folks. They want to do right by one another. They don't want to oppress or hurt people, right? So I don't think it's about people being bad or people being good. It seems to me the only other possible explanation is what? That the difference was that to be white meant you didn't have to know any better. You could just be ignorant. You could be oblivious to other people's reality, right? And that's another thing that hasn't changed in 50 years, or 30 years, or 20 years, or 100 years, right? To be white means I don't have to know people of color's truth, because it's not going to be on the test, right? By that I mean whatever test I got to take to get out of high school, get into college, grad school, med school, law school, business school, whatever test I have to take to demonstrate competence to get a job, any job in America. Hell, I can even teach in a black school district and know nothing about black children and families in their community. I can provide health care in black and brown communities and know nothing about the people to whom I'm going to provide care. I can be considered competent even if I've never had to learn anything about the people with whom I'll be working and whom I will be serving. Think about that. What does that mean? That the dominant group can remain totally oblivious to people of color's reality and still be thought of as educated? Because people of color in this room, you know it doesn't work the other direction, right? You don't get to be oblivious to our stuff. Are you kidding me? If you don't know white folk stuff, you are screwed, because that will be on the test. That will be the whole test and nothing but the test. Every test you ever took, whatever was on that test, I guarantee you some white person decided that whatever it was that was on there was important and you needed to know it, right? People of color have to learn our stuff. They have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art, and I know we don't call it that. That is the point, right? When your stuff is the norm, when your stuff is considered normal and everybody else's stuff is compared to it, right? You don't have to designate where it came from. You don't have to call it white literature. You can just call it literature, and theater, and poetry, and art. Right? It just becomes generic. It just fits in for everybody, right? This is why we don't have White History Month for those that are still tripping on that, like, because you have several. They just go by these tricky-ass names that we gave them so nobody would know what we were up to. Names like May, and June, and July, and August. All the other months that we didn't designate for somebody else, trust me, that's white folk stuff, right? And it's not like we don't talk about white folks in February either, let's be honest, we do, right? Shortest damn month of the year, we still can't spend 28 days just on black people. No. Still gonna learn about white folks on some of those days, I'm quite confident, right? But that's the point. When you're the dominant group, you don't have to really ever interrogate your norms. So those white folks in 63 and 62, they didn't have to know better. And to some extent, you still don't. Think about how ignorant we can still be and still be considered educated. Because after all, think about this country right now. We're not talking about now 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago. We're talking about right now. The reality is what? That people of color, even with a college degree, black folks first, let's talk about that, with a college degree, twice as likely to be unemployed as white folks with a degree. Even when they majored in the same subject, had the same field of study, doesn't matter. Latino folk with a degree, about 50% more likely than white folk with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree, about 25–30% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Indigenous Native North American folk, about 2/3 more likely than white folks to be out of work with a degree. And I mention this because we're in such denial about it. I got an email 2 weeks ago from a young white man who's like, I can't find a job because all the good jobs are being taken by black people and Mexicans. Yeah, really? Where the hell are these jobs that people of color are taking from white people? Are these in Second Life? Where the hell are these jobs? Are they on Minecraft? Where the hell are these jobs? Like, honest to God, where are people of color taking them? Because they can't be taking them far, right? Because if people of color are twice as likely to be unemployed as white folks with the same education, they must be taking the jobs like a block and then just being like, to hell with it, I'm dropping it, right? Because at some point, white folks are picking them back up. But this guy really believed this. He believed his problem was that people of color took all the good jobs. Of course, it's the same guy who one paragraph later tells me, as so often white folks do, they tell us, on the one hand, people of color take all the good jobs, and they turn around and say, and people of color are lazy. Okay, so which is it? Because, like, you got to pick a prejudice. Like, I don't ask much of racists because I expect very little. But consistency is good. Like, I would like you not to be a moving target. So you got to pick a bias, because if in fact you took all the jobs, I'm fairly confident you're the opposite of lazy. So you can't do both, right? And if you're truly lazy, you didn't take even one job, let alone all the jobs. So just pick a prejudice. I hate moving target racist. I hate that. I just want you to stay in one place so I can just know what I'm aiming at. That's all I'm asking. It's not much. Seems reasonable, right? But this kid was totally earnest. He really believed that people of color were both why his taxes were so high, right? Because they're not working, so we have to support them all with their tax dollars, and why they get all the jobs and he can't find one. Despite the internal contradiction of those two arguments, he really believed it. Why? Because he's been led to believe that, because we have politicians who will stoke that belief. We have politicians who will say, oh yeah, you know, immigrants are the problem, the cause of all your trouble. So we're gonna build a wall. But not just a wall. No, a wall like you wouldn't believe. Whatever the hell that means. Right? Anybody know what he means when he says that? A wall like you wouldn't. I'm going to build a wall like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to fight ISIS like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to support veterans like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to do this, that, and the other like you wouldn't believe. What the hell does any of that mean? Please, if there's a Trump translator in the room, please help me. I'm going to build a wall like you wouldn't believe. You know, the only wall I wouldn't believe is a wall made of butter. Is that what he means? Does he mean he's going to build a wall of butter? Because if so, I so do not believe that. Like, I don't think that a butter wall is going to work at all. Like, I think it's going to melt in the hot southwestern sun. I just don't believe that a butter wall is feasible, right? But unless he's talking about that, but people eat that up. I mean, and then of course, Chris Christie comes along and he says, oh, well, you're going to build a wall? Fine. I'm going to track immigrants like UPS packages because Chris Christie is going to stand on the other side of the border, and as soon as people come across, he's going to chase them down, and he's going to tell them, he's going to put a UPC code on their arm. And then I'm waiting. I figure at some point in the next couple of weeks, Carly Fiorina is going to announce her new plan for immigration, which is going to involve releasing the Kraken on the shores of the Atlantic. So we have like a sea monster that's going to gobble up people that try to swim in. But this is the absurdity of our current dialogue. But when this young man and people like him are convinced by politicians that their problems are the result of brown folk and poor brown folk at that, that's what you get, right? It's sort of fascinating because in a sense, what Donald Trump is doing is speaking to the whole history of the American race and class dilemma, right? Which is rich white people telling working class white people that their problem is other working class people who just so happen to be browner than themselves. That's the whole history of America. You want to understand America, just pay attention to Trump and the following that he has among struggling white people. Do you see any other rich people behind this man? Do you see any other billionaires actually lining up behind Donald Trump and wanting to support his campaign? No, because they know better. But you got working class folks who were suckered into believing that this guy, this rich dude, is not the source of their problem. And the economy that he represents is not the source of their problem. The problem is brown folk, not rich white folk like Donald Trump, who sent jobs overseas to take advantage of lower wages and lack of environmental protection laws and labor protection, occupational safety and health violation laws, right? It's not rich people to the problem, it's other working class people. It's fascinating. You really want to understand America, pay attention to this particular presidential election cycle, because this is the one that tells you everything that you need to know. But you see, if we're not having that conversation, we miss it. And so we miss the fact that the issues are much more structural and systemic. The problem is not people of color, not immigrants, not African Americans. The problem is an economic system that is predicated on the notion that we can't have jobs for everybody that wants one. Right now, we have 1.5 to 2 people out of work for every job opening in the economy. That's just a fact, which means everybody that wants a job can't have one. It doesn't have anything to do with their laziness, their work ethic, their desire for a job, nothing. 1.5 to 2 people out of work for every job opening, and there are 2.5 to 3 people out of work for every job opening above the poverty line. Right? That's the problem. Not immigrants, be they documented or not, but this kid, and a lot of people like him, don't want to hear that, right? So it's very much like 1962 and 63. Oh, no, there's no racial inequality. The problem is just those people, right? It's very much sort of like the blue pill from The Matrix, right? You ever see that movie? It's a good movie, even though Keanu Reeves is in it. It's still good. It's still good. It's one of his better movies, right? It's not overacted, it's well written, and Lawrence Fishburne is in it, so it's great, right? And there's a scene early on in the film, if you have seen it, that you'll recall. It's sort of important to the plot of the movie, where Lawrence Fishburne, his character, Morpheus, asks Neo, which is Keanu Reeves' character, if he would want to take one of 2 pills, right? One is red and one is blue. And he says, you can take the blue pill if you want. I'm paraphrasing him here now, but it's relatively close. He says, you can take the blue pill if you prefer, and if so, the story ends and we're done, and you can remain oblivious to what's going on, just like everybody else. That's what everybody else does. Nobody wants to know the truth. They'd rather die than know the truth. Or, he says, you can take the red pill, and you can have enlightenment, you can see what's really going on, and I can take you down the rabbit hole, and I can show you how deep it goes, right? And so Neo takes the red pill, right, and he starts to see all the stuff that's actually going on in the society about which he had really no awareness before, right? Just like most folks. And that's almost a perfect metaphor for identity, right? It's actually an almost perfect metaphor for race and gender and sexuality and class, right? Because when you're a member of the dominant group in any of those groupings that I just mentioned, or several others that I could have mentioned, right? It's like you're on the blue pill. But not just taking it, it's almost like you're born with a blue pill IV drip. Right? And you're just walking around with this thing clanking behind you. And you don't even know you're on it, right? And then somebody points it out, right? And people of color are like, don't you see all this racism that's happening? And white folks are like, nope, don't see anything. Blue pill right there, you know? And then women are like, don't you see rape culture? Men are like, nope, blue pill. And I realize that men on the blue pill means some different shit in the modern era. I do understand that. The fact that you laughed at that joke means that Pfizer has done its job as a pharmaceutical company under capitalism, so kudos to Pfizer, I suppose, right? But we're not talking about that blue pill, we're talking about the Matrix blue pill, right? Men don't have to know about rape culture and sexism and patriarchy. We can remain ignorant and oblivious, and we don't see what women see because, you know, women have to see certain things as a matter of survival. Men don't when it comes to that. Those of us who are straight or cisgendered, same thing. We don't have to see straight supremacy, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia. Those of us who are upper middle class or affluent, we don't really have to understand poverty and economic deprivation, right? We might if we're willing to listen, but we don't have to. Those of us who are able-bodied, I mean, just think about how you got in the room tonight, right? Like if you're able-bodied, there are certain advantages of obliviousness, certain privileges that you had just not having to think about stuff, right? You're not having to think about how you're going to get in the room, how you're going to get out of the room if, God forbid, there's a fire. And that's just certain visible disabilities. There are other invisible disabilities that we don't necessarily have. The other day I was speaking in, God, I can't remember where I was, but This is what happens when you travel all the time. Wherever the hell I was, they had sign language interpreters, right, on the stage. And it's a good thing because there were like 15 students who were deaf, right, who wanted to come to the talk. And if they hadn't had interpreters, would have been completely lost on them. There would have been no point in them coming. For those of us who are hearing, right, and don't have to think about autism, which is the term for institutional bias against the deaf, right, that's a huge advantage. We don't have to worry about like, oh, I got to go to class today. I wonder if I'm going to be able to get the lesson. Are they going to have interpreters? Or I'm going to go to the lecture tonight. Are they going to have interpreters? So all of these things are examples of how when you're the dominant group, you just have the ability to go to sleep on some stuff. And it doesn't make you a bad person, right? It's not about good people and bad people. You know, if you're able-bodied and you don't think about disability rights issues, it doesn't make you ableist in any intentional sense. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that you have the ability to go to sleep on some stuff. And if you don't have to know things as a matter of daily survival, the odds are really good you're not going to know them, right? It's like, I'm oblivious to calculus. Right? Apparently not the only one, right? I'm oblivious to calculus. You know why? Because I didn't take it. You know why? Because they didn't make me. And if they weren't going to make me, I sure as shit was not going to take it, man. Calculus? Are you kidding? I was horrible at math. So my thing was, I got to my freshman year of high school, I remember thinking, how am I going to construct my academic career never to have to take this class? That's how smart I was. I'm a genius that way, right? And I'm like, oh, I know, I got to take 3 years of math. Cool, I'm going to retake Algebra 1. That's what I'm going to do. I took it in 8th grade, but you know what? I think I could do better the second time. So I'm going to take it again. Took it again, took geometry, then took Algebra 2. I didn't even take trig, let alone calculus. So as a result, if I were to stand up here on the stage and try to do calculus for you, you would all immediately know. Even if you had never taken it, you'd be like, hold on, I don't think he knows what he's doing. And I think he just told me he never took the class. Exactly. But see, that's how identity functions in this country. Those of us who are white sometimes appear to believe that we understand racism better than people of color do. And we never had to take the class, right? Those of us who are men act like we actually know when sexism and patriarchy and rape culture are operating better than women do. And we never had to take the class. You get my point? Right? When you're a member of the dominant group, you didn't have to learn this stuff, but somehow you still think you know it better, just like those white folks in 63 and 62 who were looking it dead in the face and couldn't see it. So it strikes me that maybe the better course of action here is for us to step back and start to ask the question, who do we trust to interpret social reality on these issues, and to whom do we listen? Because it seems to me our inability to listen to people of color and to honor their reality is the source of our trouble. And you can think about that with regard to some very important recent issues. One, law enforcement conflicts between people of color and police, and the other is immigration. I want to spend a little time on both before I'm done. I think it's very obvious, if you look around, that white folks and people of color, by and large, obvious exceptions to both, but that white folks and people of color, by and large, have very different understandings of law enforcement because they have very different relationships to law enforcement, both historically and today. And if we don't understand that, those of us who are white, then it becomes very difficult, doesn't it, to really appreciate where folks of color are coming from when they demand that Black lives matter, right? Because that phrase, for those of us who don't understand where it's coming from, which is from a system that has never believed that Black lives really mattered and never treated Black lives as if they did, somehow then we get defensive and we say things like, all lives matter. No, no. Yes, precious, I know. I know that all lives matter, I'm clear on that, but here's the difference. Those of us who are white, our lives always mattered institutionally in this society. The fact that they mattered was woven into the fabric of the country, so much so that the very first law Congress ever passed after the Constitution was ratified was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens. So you see, our lives always meant something in this society, right? If an enslaved person killed their owner, they would be killed. If an owner killed their enslaved property, nothing would be done to them. There was nothing illegal about that. So we knew that some lives mattered when others didn't. You only have to proclaim it when it's something that's been denigrated. You don't have to say all lives matter or white lives matter. That is taken for granted. That is assumed. The reason it's important to proclaim that black lives matter is because the system has always acted as though they didn't. But unless you know the history of the way that people of color have experienced law enforcement, it's very hard to understand that. And I want to be very transparently clear. This is not an attack on individuals who are law enforcement officials. This is an attack on a system. Right? This is not about people, this is about systems, right? A culture, and the way that the culture of law enforcement historically has treated people of color. And there have always been individuals in law enforcement who stood against that. The problem is, increasingly, when they do stand up against it, they get run out of law enforcement. So you can go home tonight and get on YouTube, and I wish I remembered the guy's name. I keep looking it up, and I keep writing it down, and then I keep forgetting it. But there's a young guy, looks like he's about 12, but I think he's in his early 30s. And he was actually in Afghanistan and or Iraq. Young white dude, Baltimore cop. And when he came back from military service, he was in the Marines. And when he came back, he became a member of the Baltimore PD, which of course has been fraught with major drama lately because the death of Freddie Gray in police custody. They basically put him in the back of a van, refused to strap him into a seatbelt, even though they'd been told to do that for months. They gave him this really hard ride around. They basically put him in there, they chained him behind his back, and they drove around knocking him against the walls. Now 6 cops have been indicted. We'll see what happens, right? This is a ridiculous policy and practice intended to brutalize. And this young man, white guy, who had stood up against that kind of mistreatment in the Baltimore PD that he had seen while he was on the job. He saw brutality, he saw corruption, he saw suspects being roughed up and beaten and having evidence planted on them and all these things, and he stood up against it, and what happened? They ran him out of policing, right? They ran him out. They ended his career. Basically, he didn't feel safe any longer, because there were people on the force who he couldn't trust now to actually have his back, because he wondered whether or not they were gunning for him, because there were all kinds of rumors that they were. So this is a young man who ends up getting run out of his chosen profession because he did the right things. It's not about good cops, bad cops. There are plenty of good cops. The problem is when they stand up and really try to do good, too oftentimes those who are bad, right, end up drowning them out. And as a result, they can't really do what they, a bad culture can twist a good person, right? And law enforcement historically, and the way it's related to black and brown folks, is just not like it's related to us if we're white. And unless we understand that history, we can't have a conversation about this. We can't even understand what's in the news, because we look at policing and we think, well, cops are the ones that get your cat out of the tree, right? Or they're the ones that, give you a ride around to show you how exciting it is to be an officer. That's not the historic role of law enforcement in black communities. What people of color know, and what I fear most white folks have never really had to learn, and even a lot of cops have never had to learn. But it would make their job a lot easier if they knew it, because then they'd understand this too, and then it would maybe create a different kind of rapport, if they were willing to, between law enforcement and communities of color, is, cops are the ones that enforced runaway slave codes. Cops are the ones who enforced the slave patrol. Cops were the ones who enforced the black codes in the wake of emancipation. They were the ones who engaged in lynchings of black bodies by releasing suspected criminals into the hands of the mob. They were the ones who engaged in riots against black communities in places like East St. Louis, Illinois. 150 people killed, 37 children. Their heads bashed against rocks and thrown into bonfires with the collaboration of law enforcement. Places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, same thing. It was police who pulled civil rights demonstrators off of stools at lunch counters to enforce law and order. This is what people of color think about, because that's their history. There hasn't been one decade where people of color had a positive experience with law enforcement, because law enforcement's job is to enforce the law, and the law was set up by white folks to protect our stuff from them. It's not necessarily cops' fault, right? It's those rich folks that pass the laws, but then they get the cops to do their dirty work, which is ironic because cops don't make good money, right? But they got rich people passing laws and then getting working class people known as law enforcement to enforce their laws for them. That's fascinating stuff, right? Getting working class white folks disproportionately to enforce laws that benefit rich white people. Wow, it's heavy, right? And so enforcing segregation, enforcing Jim Crow, enforcing enslavement, law enforcement implicated in the killing of 21 members of the Black Panther Party with the collaboration of the FBI in the late 60s and early 70s, planting evidence on criminal suspects in Los Angeles in the Ramparts Division scandal. Right? One of the biggest police scandals in the last 20 or so years are in the 7-5 precinct in Brooklyn. You can watch the documentary on that one. You should. It's called the 7-5. You should watch it. talks about how law enforcement in New York and Brooklyn, in one of the most quote-unquote dangerous precincts in the city in the 1980s, was actively involved in running drugs, collaborating with drug dealers, killing people, ordering hits on people, right? This is what people of color know. And that doesn't mean that every cop, or even that the majority of cops are implicated in that, but it does mean that if I'm a person of color, I'm going to have a very different understanding of law enforcement. And if we want to have a productive discussion about how to create a more just and equitable society, and I'm a white person want to engage in that conversation, I've got to know that history, because I just can't come to it with my lens thinking that I understand the subject and that I can have a productive conversation with someone. I mean, people of color know that it's cops who enforce the war on drugs, which, by the way, if you didn't already know this, is not a war on drugs. You must be kidding. In fact, to think it's a war on drugs, you would have to be high. Right? It's not a war on drugs, because the drug usage rates and the drug dealing rates are virtually identical across racial lines, contrary to popular perception, which says that it's black folks and Latino folks, who use drugs more than whites. That's not true. Or that they're the ones who deal drugs more than whites. That's just not true. There's no evidence that says that. All the evidence says the opposite. It says that the usage rates and the dealing rates are either equal or even in some cases higher for white folks. But who's getting arrested, right? Black folks 4 times more likely to be arrested for weed than white folks, even though the usage rates are the same. 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than white folks for drugs, even though the usage and dealing rates are the same, right? But to be honest with you, I didn't even need to know those numbers. I could have told you that from personal experience, because if the war on drugs were actually about drugs, I'm not really sure who'd be giving this lecture tonight. But I'm really sure who it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be this guy, because I don't think they let you Skype in a lecture from prison, and that is where I would be if the war on drugs were actually about drugs. And I can tell you that now because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, so can't do nothing to me now, right? But that's the truth. I worked in public housing for 15 months, like I told you, and I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing projects in New Orleans than I saw on a typical Saturday night in my dorm room, freshman year of college at Tulane University. But I knew they weren't coming to arrest me. Never had to worry about that, right? That's privilege, right? The knowledge that you're never going to be suspected in the same way, that's real. That is tangible impact. And for people of color, that's going to affect the way that they view law enforcement, right? So the only way we're really going to break that, we have to come up with whole different systems. It's not about just retraining cops or getting rid of bad cops or hiring better cops. It's about having a different culture, right? That says that law enforcement has to be collaborative with the community, and that the community has to have some role in deciding who's going to police their streets. I think that would actually be better for cops and communities. I mean, think if police had to spend the first 60 to 90 days on the force, right, without badges and without guns and without the power to arrest, but just going into the neighborhood that they're going to police and actually getting to know people, right? Walking door to door, knocking on doors, meeting with people in coffee shops and barber shops and churches and mosques and, the school and the community center, and just getting to know people on the street and spending maybe 2 to 3 months doing that, where you actually get to sit and forge relationships with the people that you're going to be policing. And then at the end of the 60 to 90 days, the community gets to vote on whether or not you get to be a cop in that community, right? So it isn't just about whether you can shoot a gun, not about whether you got the physical strength to be an officer. It's about whether or not the community believes that they can trust you. Now, here's what would be good about that for everybody, not just the community, but for the officer. Because if I'm going to be an officer in a space where I'm not trusted, I'm not safe, right? You want to be an officer in a place where nobody respects you and nobody trusts you and they fear you and you think you're there to control them? You're not safe. I would be far safer as an officer if I had 2 to 3 months to get to know you, because then when you see me on the street, you know that I'm not there as an occupier, right? You know that I'm there to help, because you remember sitting in the coffee shop and I showed you pictures of my kids and you showed me pictures of your kids. Now we have some trust. Now you know me, you don't fear me, and I don't fear you. Now everybody is safer. But we don't do that, right? Instead, what we do is we give law enforcement officials, we give them tanks, military equipment that's been decommissioned from war zones, and we put them in camouflage. You saw what happened in Ferguson. They had cops rolling out in camo. I want you to really think about that for a minute. What does that mean that we're giving law enforcement camo? We're giving them fatigues. Do you have any idea? Like camouflage, there are 2 types of camouflage in this country, right? One is sort of old school Southeast Asian Vietnam War camouflage, which is meant to blend in the jungle. And the other is like Desert Storm and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq camo, which is meant to blend in the desert. Which of those are operative in Ferguson? Which of those are operative in inner city Baltimore? Which of those are operative in any urban area? Neither one. So when you're wearing that stuff, it's not about blending in. If you wanted to have camo that would blend in an urban environment, you'd be wearing clothing that looked like the check cashing outlet, right? That would blend in, because that's what they have in urban areas instead of banks, is they have check cashing outlets and pawn shops. So if you had clothing that said like pawn shop, then that shit might actually trick somebody, right? But if you're wearing desert camo in an urban environment, what you're doing is you're not trying to blend in, you're not trying to hide, what you're trying to do is tell people in the community, we're at war with you. You are the enemy. We were in Fallujah. Fallujah is over now. We are here. That's the message that those communities receive. And that's not necessarily the fault of any individual officer, but it's the fault of a culture that has placed such a premium on control and domination rather than collaboration. That young dude from Baltimore I told you about, that cop, tells this great story. You can see it on YouTube. He's done all these interviews. He talks about how when he was a cop, all of his commendations, all of his raises, all of his promotions were based on how many arrests he made. That was the only metric. It wasn't about whether crime went down in his precinct. Like, that would be a really good metric, right? Did you actually work in a precinct where crime dropped? Maybe that had something to do with your policing. No, they gave him no credit for that. There were no pats on the back for that, no plaudits for that. If crime went down, it didn't matter. If you resolved conflicts without resorting to violence or arrest, like let's say that you were assigned to deal with domestic violence incidents and you're able to get in between situations and resolve them or resolve conflicts on the street without resorting to arrest. That's a skill. That's an important skill. But were you rewarded for that? No, this guy's like, no, that didn't matter. All that mattered was my arrest numbers. So when my arrest numbers dropped, because I didn't want to hassle dudes for slinging dime bags on the corner, right? When I knew there were much bigger crimes going on behind closed doors in wealthier communities, they put me out, he says, into a wealthier neighborhood where there was much less crime, at least in the overt, out in the open sense, at least, much less crime, right? And so his arrest numbers plummeted because there was nobody to arrest that he could see on the street. So he would find himself going back into the hood to just like shake down drug dealers just to keep his arrest numbers up, right? I mean, this is a guy who's saying like there's something wrong with the culture and the expectations. It isn't about policing inherently, right? It's about what we're expecting. So again, if we don't understand that, if we don't have a clear understanding of that history and how people come to it differently, it's really hard to have a productive conversation or think about ways to do things differently. Same is true with immigration. Right? The reason that Donald Trump is able to capitalize on all this hostility toward certain immigrants, again, not all immigrants, certain immigrants, is because we have created a fictional narrative in this country about why certain people come to America, right? Why certain people come to the U.S. And so the fiction that we've told, well, we've told a couple fictions. One is that a lot of white folks are real quick to say, well, now I don't mind them coming. I just want them to come the right way, legally, like my family. The hell? Legally, like your family, right? Do we really think that? Do we really think that like our great-grandparents deserve some credit for not breaking a law that didn't exist? Like, do you realize there was no law in place when your folks came? Like, do we understand that? There was no law that said they couldn't. So the fact that your great whatever didn't break a law that wasn't even on the books, they don't get cookies for that. Like, that's no reference to their character at all. And I'll tell you what, if my great-grandfather if Russia had been right next door to the United States, I can tell you, as sure as I'm standing here, that I don't think for 1 minute, as desperate as he was to provide opportunity for his children that was being denied in his home country, I don't doubt for 1 second he would have crossed that border. Do you actually think that any of your ancestors wouldn't have if their countries had been right next door to ours? I mean, obviously it's different when you're having to cross the ocean. Some people do and some people don't. But if Russia was right there, if Ireland was right there, if Italy was right there, do you actually think that your ancestors would have been like, well, I'd love to feed my family, but I wouldn't want to break the law? The hell are you talking about? Of course your family would have come, but we've created this fiction that says, well, we didn't, we came for principles like liberty and freedom, and they're just coming for stuff. The hell are you talking about? We came for stuff. Freedom and liberty? Good God, we spent most of the time in the colonies killing each other for being witches and shit like that. Like, just like burning people, hanging people, drowning people. It wasn't even what we did just to African people and indigenous folks and Mexicans when we jacked half of their land. It's just what we did to each other for not being good enough Christians. Right? Liberty and freedom. You think we believed in that? What history book have you been reading? We didn't believe in that. We came for stuff, man. The same stuff that Mexicans come for, opportunity. The same stuff Guatemalans come for, and Sri Lankans come for, and Vietnamese and Lao folks come for, and Nigerians come for. Opportunity that they feel doesn't exist in their own country. There's no shame in any of that. But we've created a lie, and then that allows us to remain divided from them. We don't see them in us, and we don't see us in them. Because we're so busy saying, well, they're coming for stuff like jobs and welfare, and we just came for principles. But we came for stuff too. We came for land. We came for opportunity. We came for food. We came for reasons that James Baldwin said. He said most of Europe, most of the white folks who came were starving. They couldn't make it. Many of them were convicts, right? And Baldwin also told us the biggest myth that white folks ever told ourselves was that we as white folks believed that our ancestors wanted to come here too. But they didn't want to come here any more than anybody else did. You think anybody likes to pick up their shit and move? Nobody likes to do that. Most people live and die 60 miles from where they're born. Nobody likes to pick up and move anywhere, let alone across an ocean, let alone to a different country with a different language. Nobody wants to do that. You do it because you have no choice. Let's be clear. Our ancestors, those of us from Europe, were the losers of their societies. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I'm not trying to be cruel, right? You don't have to clap for that, though, cool, whatever. But we're saying, like, we were the losers. Like, just like own that for a minute, right? Because we don't like to hear that. We're like, well, that's not my family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, shh. You might not want to brag about that. If you actually knew who was on that boat and all the other early boats, you think they were the winners of Europe? You think the people that came over on the Mayflower, because that's what Trump says, well, Mexico's not sending their best. The hell, you think England sent their best? Who do you think got on the boat, man? Who do you think came here to this colony, right? Who do you think settled this plantation, right? Who do you think did that? You think it was the best and the brightest of Europe? No, the best and the brightest of Europe were kicking so much ass in Europe, they didn't leave. That's the point. Like, if you were doing well, why would you get on the boat? Why in the hell would you suddenly wake up one summer morning and be like, well, now, I think we're doing pretty splendidly over here, but I've got an idea, family, and I just want you to stick with me for just a second. Play along, play along. I've got an idea. I know it's going well. We have a lot of gold, a lot of treasure. The king invited us to his palace last week for dinner. It was fabulous. But I think what we ought to do is get on a boat, a rickety old 17th century ship that might take on water. We might drown. We might even be eaten by sharks. But it will be an adventure. Nobody said that. The only people who got on the boat were the losers who were getting their ass kicked in the system as it was. The king wasn't on the boat. Nobody the king liked was on the boat. Nobody that was a friend of the king was on the boat, right? And it was an act of resistance, and there's no shame in it, by the way. None. In fact, there's a lot of pride that we ought to take in that, right? If your ancestor as an act of resistance decided to rebel against marginality by striking out to try to start a new life, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, right? But it's also really cool when brown folk do that, right? It's really cool when folks from south of that artificial border do that. And the fact that we've created this fictional narrative allows us to distinguish ourselves from them, and then we end up missing the bigger issues, right? Which is that when we talk about them as the scapegoat and we blame them for all of our problems, we miss the bigger problems, don't we? This is why addressing the privilege of obliviousness is so important. That's a very dangerous privilege to indulge. When you're oblivious as to the real problems because people have convinced you to blame these other brown folk for your problems, then you don't actually see the problems as they are. So we end up blaming brown folk rather than the companies that sent the jobs overseas, right? We end up blaming working class people rather than the affluent that looted Wall Street. $12.5 trillion looted by a bunch of rich white dudes on Wall Street, 20% of the collective net worth of this country that it took over 230 years to accumulate. These rich white men wiped it out in 18 months. 18 months. And people get mad at me when I point out that they were rich white men. It's like, well, that's sort of racist. Nope, not racist, just descriptive, right? And if they'd all been black folks that jacked $12.5 trillion, all y'all would have noticed, right? Black people steal $12 trillion. Somebody notices that they were black. Brown folks steal $12 trillion. Somebody notices that they were brown. People of color generally make off with $12.5 trillion worth of somebody else's money, and we're going to have conversations about their culture and their mama and the community they came from and their biological predisposition to irrationality and illegality. But white folks do that, and all of a sudden everybody's colorblind. That's interesting. We don't notice color when white folks do crazy stuff like that. People of color do messed up stuff, it sticks to everybody. White folks do it, we don't even want to talk about the fact that they were white. That's true whether it's Wall Street, whether it's school shootings, right? Whatever it is. People of color do that stuff, or whether it's terrorism, right? God forbid you're a brown-skinned Muslim engaged in terrorism. This is going to stick to every Muslim on the planet. If you're Tim McVeigh, Terry Nichols, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right? All these folks. Right? Doesn't stick to any of the rest of us. None of us have to worry about that. 237 some odd abortion clinic bombings in the last 20 years in North America, mostly in the US, also in Canada, almost all of them done by people who were white and who called themselves Christians, but now it didn't stick, did it? We don't have people running around saying, when are the churches going to condemn this? When are Christians going to uniformly condemn the bombing of family planning clinics and the shooting of abortion doctors? And the reason we don't ask for that is we understand that's not what all Christians think. But that's the privilege, isn't it, of being the dominant group in this regard. You don't have to answer for the actions of some, right? So that's the point. So we end up missing this. We end up missing the fact that for that young man who wrote to me and said his problem finding a job was people of color, right? It wasn't that. It was that economy that I mentioned before that doesn't create enough jobs for people, right? The biggest problem in this country has nothing to do with this. It has to do with these larger issues of inequality that we never talk about because we're so busy bashing the people below us rather than talking about the folks above. The fact is we have 1/10 of 1% of the American population. 1/10 of 1%, the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%, which is about 320,000 people, right, that have the same collective net worth as the bottom 90% of the American population, which is about 300 million people. 280, 290 million, right? 290 million over here, 320,000 over here. Think about that. Right? Do we actually think that the wealthiest 320,000 people are just that much smarter? They have 70,000 times the annual income of the typical American household. Let me repeat that. The top 1/10 of 1% of American households make 70,000 times what the typical American household makes in a given year. Do you think that's about merit? Because having a hard time wrapping my head around that. Is it possible that the wealthiest 400 white people in America, who have a collective net worth of 2.3 trillion, have actually worked as hard as all 40 million black folks? Because it just so happens that 40 million African Americans also have a combined net worth of 2.3 trillion. 40 million black folks, $2.3 trillion in net worth. 400 white people, $2.3 trillion in net worth. Do we actually think white people work that much harder, prayed that much harder, have brains that much bigger? Where the hell do we store those brains? Where is it? Do we have like a wormhole that we crawl into where time stands still and we can work like 400 hours a week? Everybody else only has so many, 24 hours a day times 7, but we've got thousands of hours in our wormhole and then we shoot out the other end and that's why we have so much money. Does anybody believe that? Like, the hell, right? That's the problem. We have a system of such incredible inequity. We have right now 30 people in this country, the wealthiest 30 people in the United States, that have the same net worth as the bottom half of the population. 160 million people over here, 30 people over here. That's the problem, right? We have the 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, 5 of whom were born into the Walton family, 1 of whom married in, right, who have a collective net worth that is so high that it's equal to the poorest 40% of the American population, just 6 people. 6 people and 127 to 130 million. Same net worth. Those 6 Walton heirs have so much money they could buy every house in Seattle, every condo in Seattle, every townhome in Seattle, or every house, every condo, every townhome in Dallas, or every house, every condo, every townhome in Miami, and still have $40 billion left with which to buy all the houses in Anaheim if their kids like Disney, or all the houses in Napa if they like wine, right? And they'd still have $4 or $5 or $6 billion left. Just to put that in some perspective, a lot of people think Oprah's rich. That's what people always say. Well, Oprah's rich. Oprah is not Walton rich. Oprah has enough money that she could buy every house in Mokina, Illinois, wherever the hell that is, right? But that ain't Dallas, that ain't Seattle, that ain't Miami, right? You can take all the money of Donald Trump and Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, and Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, and Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Oprah, and Jerry Jones, the president and the CEO of the Dallas Cowboys, and Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. You could put all of that money together, and it would still not even come to half the money that the Waltons have. You could add Bill Gates, who's the wealthiest man on the planet, and it still would be $15 billion short of all the money that the Waltons have. Meanwhile, the Walton family and their company, which is the biggest employer in the United States and one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest on the planet, pays their employees such crappy wages that the vast majority of them can't even come above the poverty line and can't afford to feed their families. They pay their workers sub-poverty wages, so much so that then those workers have to turn around and get on food stamps in order to feed their families, and then turn to food drives, which they set up in the aisles of Walmart every Thanksgiving. Pay attention in 4 weeks from now, roughly, when they start doing that, setting up food bins so that workers can contribute to buy other workers from that company turkeys for Thanksgiving to feed their families, turkeys which they would be able to buy themselves if this company, the wealthiest on the face of the earth, was willing to pay them a living wage. But they've got 6 people that have the same collective net worth of the poorest 130 million people in this country, and they're paying people so badly that they have to turn to food stamps. And then let me ask you, where do you think they redeem their food stamps? At Walmart. Walmart is the biggest single redeemer of food stamps in the United States. They make money on both ends. They pay crappy wages. Then you, the taxpayer, get to subsidize this wealthy employer by picking up the tab for the money that they won't pay in wages. And they turn around and take the taxpayer subsidy known as SNAP, what we used to call food stamps. Then they buy the food at Walmart. Walmart makes $13.5 billion in additional profit every year off food stamp redemption, a huge percentage of it from their own employees. That's our problem. Is an economy that allows for that. And you know what? Ain't no black folk did that. Ain't no brown folk did that. No poor folk of any color did that. That's rich white people. So we just need to be clear here, right? There are real adversaries, but they're not the ones we're looking for. There are real problems, but they're not the ones that we're proclaiming. But unless we understand that, whether we're talking about law enforcement or whether we're talking about the issue of immigration, or whether we're talking about the issue of the economy, right? There are real things we need to be concerned about. And all the stuff that we've got politicians and others drawing about and talking about and pointing at, they're rarely ever the real problem. So part of our job is going to be to change that narrative. Part of our job is going to be to interrogate all that stuff that we take for granted. Right? First and foremost, the idea this is about good people and bad people. Get that out of your mind. Most folks are good. Most teachers are good, but they can be in a bad system. Most cops are good, but they can be in a bad system. Most employers are decent folk, but they can be in a bad system, right? Most social workers, most doctors, most nurses, right, are good people, but they can be in a bad system. And if you're in a bad system, you can be twisted and distorted beyond your own recognition to where you can't even do the job that you came to do. Teachers always tell me that, right? Early childhood ed teachers that just started, new teachers, they always say, I ask them, why'd you get into education? They say, well, education is the great equalizer. Where? You've been paying attention? You think education is the great equalizer? Where the hell is that true? Has that ever been true in this country? No, man. Education is an unequalizer. That's why they make it so expensive, so you can't even afford to go to college. You think that that's an equalizer? If it was an equalizer, they'd make damn sure you could afford it without having to graduate with $35, $40, $45, $50, $55, $60,000 worth of debt. See, when I graduated from college, the average student debt was $9,000. Now, mine was a lot more than that because I went to one expensive-ass college. But for average students, $9,000 a year in 1990. Now the average is $35,000. And that's the average when you consider state schools and private schools. So that tells you a lot, right? Because that means the private is a lot higher, obviously, because that's an aggregate figure. So we've basically quadrupled the student debt. You think education is an equalizer? Clearly it isn't. Education is intended to select a handful of people and give them lots of great opportunities and basically screw everybody else, right? So when teachers want to do the right thing, they get into education for all the right reasons. Just like a lot of cops get into law enforcement for the right reasons. They really do want to serve the community. But if you get into a system that is about domination and control and sorting and separating and limiting opportunity rather than expanding, and if you get into a system as an educator, the job of which is to provide opportunities for a narrow few and everybody else works for those people, right? Then whatever your intentions are don't mean anything anymore unless that system changes. Same is true with law enforcement. Same is true with nursing. Same is true with social work. Same is true with psychology. Same is true with any profession. So we have to really get to a point where we're interrogating all that stuff that we take for granted and recognizing that we have a broken system. If you're standing at the end of a sausage machine in a sausage factory and it's like a conveyor belt and you're sitting there and you keep wondering why the machine keeps giving you sausage, and you're at the end of the machine, you're like, I want some damn chicken nuggets. The hell, you're not going to get chicken nuggets. It's a sausage machine, fool. That's what it was programmed to give you. It's like what Bev Tatum talks about. It's like being at a airport with a moving sidewalk, right? Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's the president emeritus at Spelman, right? She talks about the moving sidewalk. You ever be on a moving sidewalk at the airport? What does it do? It takes you from point A to point B, regardless of what you do. You don't have to lift a foot. You don't have to walk actively. You just got to stand there. And it'll take you from point A to point B because that is what it is programmed to do. So without any effort, you will end up where that thing was intended to take you. And the same is true with the society, right? It will take you where it's intended to take you until you are prepared to turn around and walk the opposite direction on the moving sidewalk and decide that you're going to rebel against the moving sidewalk and walk in a different direction to create a different reality. And let me tell you, we don't have a lot of time to figure that out. We got like 30 years, maybe. Because in 30 years, half the country will be people of color, half will be white. That's just a fact. And it doesn't matter what Trump says about it. It doesn't matter what anybody says. I know there's some white people in Arizona pissed. I want my country back, but whatever. I've been in Arizona. I've seen these white people. Their average age is 137 years old. So, you know, TikTok. I'm not advocating their death. Please don't tweet that shit. That's not what I said. I hope they live a long time. I'm just saying death and age sort of correlated, generally, in the social science literature. So the odds are that if we are committed to multicultural democracy, they probably won't get their country back, so to speak, right? But if we don't figure it out pretty soon, we're going to be in trouble. Because what happens if we get to that day 30 years from now, and we're still a country where half of the population, people of color, are twice as likely as the other half, white, to be unemployed? It's not a really good recipe for economic health, is it? Or if you have one half of the population, people of color, that's 3 times as likely to be poor as the other half. It's not a recipe for economic health. 1/15 the net worth of the other half, 9 years less life expectancy than the other half, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight kids. Like, to me, all that stuff adds up to real disaster. Like, that's a calamity for everyone. That's not just bad for people of color. That's bad for white folks. That's bad for white children. It's bad for white grandchildren. It's bad for white families, because you can't maintain a healthy economy, a healthy society on the basis of that level of inequality. So when we talk about this stuff, we're not talking about charity work. This is not about what white folks can do to help people of color, let alone, God forbid, to save them. Right? People of color will save themselves from white supremacy. I'm convinced of that. And I think people of color are the only hope that people of color have to ultimately do that. The question, for those of us who are white at least, I think, is who's going to deliver us from white supremacy? Because this thing that we've done, this system that we've allowed to exist, is asking an awful lot of us. It's asking a lot of us to compromise our humanity for the sake of relative advantage, asking us to give away the possibility of a functioning society just to remain one step ahead. That's been the whole history of America, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, right? This idea that, well, I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. Really? That's enough? Knowing that you're better off than someone else, even while rich folks walk off with all the loot, that's all you need, is to know that you're above somebody? See, it seems to me we ought to get clear. Psychological wages might feel real good for the moment, but they don't pay your rent. And psychological wages won't pay your health bill when your family member gets sick, and they won't pay for your college education, and they won't pay for your mortgage. At the end of the day, they're not really enough, are they? But we've been convinced for decades and for generations that they were. We have a very limited time within which to pull out of this problem. And I suggest to you that from this point forward, you give that some really serious thought, because I happen to believe that we're better than this as a people. I don't just mean as white folks, I mean as Americans, I mean as human beings. I actually believe, and I could be wrong, I could be splendidly, spectacularly wrong in having any faith in the human species whatsoever. We could very well be doomed. I don't know. But what I do know is if we don't act as if it's possible to create justice, if we don't at least act on the premise that we can do better than this, we will definitely get no better than this. And we'll be having this conversation in 20 years and 40 years and 60 years and 100 years only. I promise you, if it comes to that, that conversation will be far more dangerous in 20 or 40 or 60 or 80 or 100 years, because if we wait that long to get it together, we don't have much time at all within which to make it happen, and we're going to be doomed for sure. And our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to curse us for handing them that problem and for not resolving it. So it's not anyone's fault in this room that you've inherited this legacy, but it is our responsibility to do something about it. There's a big difference, right, between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel for the shit you actually did. Right? And responsibility is what you take because of the kind of human being that you are. So at the end of the day, if you want to be a responsible human being, you have to stand up and demand that we're capable of justice and we're capable of equity and that you're willing to bank your life on the prospects of that. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you. And thanks. Thanks, and I'll be happy to take a few questions. We've got some mics. I think we've got one over there, I see. We also have one over here, sort of it's on the back riser thing here. So if you have questions, if you're physically able to come to the mic, that'd be great. If you're not, we can try to get a mic to you, I suppose. Or if you just want to, and you promise to be loud enough to be heard, then I can call on you from the seats as well. I know sometimes getting out of your seat, particularly if you're surrounded by a sea of other people, it can be a bit of a pain in the ass. So whatever you want to do, or alternately, we can just sit and stare at each other, which is lots of fun for both of us, I'm sure. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you all so much for being here. Anyone?
Hello.
Hi.
I don't know if I need the mic, but I'll just say. Okay. So last year was what I considered a breaking point because of everything with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I saw people commenting on race that would never comment on it on social media. Everybody was talking about it. And so from my perspective, if that wasn't enough to change the issue, because like now it's dying, everybody's tired of it. People are tired of talking. It's like race fatigue, as I've heard it with the internet. If that wasn't enough,
Right.
Can we honestly have hope that it'll change?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, yeah, it's died among certain people, but let's also be real clear, and I want to give real credit to the organizers around the country who continue to keep this stuff front and center. There is some amazing organizing going on right now, not just BLM folks and BYP 100 folks. You should Google them as well, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. By all means, Google them. I think it's mxgm.com or .org. Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, LBS Baltimore. It's a Baltimore-based group that works on criminal justice reform and also education, progressive and radical educational reform. So there's some great stuff going on. Now, it's not as prominent in the news as it was a year ago. And let's not, however, take that to mean that it's not happening. Sometimes, right, the media tires of focusing on this stuff even when it's still going on. There's a lot of incredible work. In fact, there's even some really good work among white allies. All those groups I just mentioned a second ago were people of color led, but there's also a group showing up for racial justice, SURJ, Surge, doing incredible work around the country, 40 different chapters roughly all around the United States that are working with white folks to try to encourage white folks to stand up and show up and really, figure out what does it mean to be an ally working in solidarity with people of color in this moment. And it's amazing some of the stuff they're doing. People working with, white congregations and Unitarian churches to, demand that Black Lives Matter and that these mostly white churches are gonna organize around that principle, even though they're catching a lot of heat for it. Or white folks, some of the folks in Surge are going door to door in suburban white communities, knocking on doors and talking about white supremacy and talking about white privilege and talking about police accountability. That takes guts, man. I remember in the 80s doing like canvassing for Greenpeace, and we were afraid to go to people's doors to talk about whales and dolphins, right? Like, honest to God, like, oh my God, I hope I don't get shot on this porch. But imagine going to somebody's house and you're not talking about whales and dolphins and acid rain, which is frankly easier. You're talking about like, hey, white person, I'm another white person, and I'd like to talk to you about white supremacy. What do you say? And I know it's dinner, but can we talk? And and they're doing that. And I don't know if that's going to have any effect, right? Whether that's valuable, but I do know that it's pretty gutsy to say, you have these folks who are standing up and really saying, like, I've got to show up in this moment. So let's not be dissuaded by the lack of media attention or even social media, because folks go back to sleep, and it's always the way it is. Like if you go back, if there had been social media in the 60s, right, I guarantee you that when the Birmingham campaign touched off in 63, when the bombing happened, and the 4 girls were killed in the church, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and Bull Connor turned his tanks on people. If there had been social media, that would have been in social media every day, every day, every day, every day, and then I promise you, by late 63, early 64, it would have been gone for most people. Not everyone, but for most people. So I think we have this, we have a naive remembrance of how, it used to be everybody was active. Most people never were active. Most people did not march with Dr. King. Most people were not involved in the struggle. And so the fact that most people today are taking a pass, that's exactly like it was during the high water mark of the movement, where most people also were taking a pass. So let's not get discouraged. I think that there's some amazing work happening. There's a lot more to be done. I don't want us to be Pollyanna about it. I don't want us to be naive about how great things are either. But I would never want to gauge how much great work is being done just based on, like what white people are posting on social media, or for that matter, what black folks are posting on social media. I think that sometimes, that's going to give you a good idea of the majority, but the majority has never, ever been in the movement. Any movement, doesn't matter what movement you talk about. The majority wasn't part of the abolition struggle. The majority wasn't part of the, anti-segregation struggle. The majority wasn't part of the women's struggle, wasn't part of the labor movement, And most people just sort of go along, unfortunately, with the way things are, which means the rest of us who choose not to go along can have a real outsized impact if we're prepared to do the work, because most people are sleeping. And while they're sleeping, we can be plotting. While they're sleeping, we can be doing our thing. So, thank you for the question, though. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. I have a question. Because you were talking about white denial versus white acknowledgement, and I think a lot of white people nowadays acknowledge that there is a institutionalized racism problem. However, they're talking about it, but I don't see much action, especially in my community or amongst my friends even. They're talking about it, but I want to see something.
Yeah.
Doing something. And I wonder if maybe you have some advice, even to people who are here, about ways that we can move in our community.
Right. Well, I think that, although I do think that most white folks still don't acknowledge the gravity of the problem, I think your point is well taken. There certainly are some who do, and yet, of those who do, probably a disproportionate number of them are not necessarily acting in accordance with an attempt to end those problems. So I think that part of it is this learned helplessness, which is somewhat ironic, right? When you're the most privileged group or you're the most powerful group in a culture, for you to be helpless in the face of an obstacle is sort of weird. You would think that you would know, like, I can do this, right? But a lot of times I think we learn this helplessness and we don't know where to begin, and we're afraid we're going to screw up, we're going to do the wrong thing. I think the first order of business is to follow people of color and pay attention to what they're doing. And that's something we all can do, because, right now on social media, white folks might be going silent about these issues. People of color are not. There have actually been some interesting studies, right, about the social media feeds of white Americans versus Americans of color in the wake of, let's say, Ferguson and Ever Since, or really in the wake of Trayvon Martin, Ever Since. And there's a marked difference, right, between the kind of stuff that people of color post and the kind of stuff that white folks post. And it really gives you an insight into sort of where people are, right? So it's like, it's cat pictures and pictures of food versus, memes about racism. And that's hard to bridge that gap. But I think for white folks who want to bridge it, right, it's about following what people of color are doing. It's about spreading their wisdom. It's about sharing their information. It's about showing up at when they have rallies and demonstrations and teach-ins and meetings and asking, what you can do, and figuring out, not even asking, just figuring out what you can do to assist in that. And So that's number one, is paying really close attention and following the lead of people of color. The second thing that I think white folks can do is begin to interrogate our own stories. Part of the reason that we don't get active, in my experience, is that we aren't clear of just how implicated we are in this problem. So it's abstract to us, right? So it's oh, I took a class and I read a book, or I came to a Tim Wise lecture and I heard all these statistics and all this information and all this analysis, but it's still somewhat abstract. So my recommendation to people is that you actually sit down and you interrogate your own story. Like, how has race impacted your life? How is your identity? And I think men should do this around sex as well, and gender, and I think straight folks should around, sexual orientation, and I think that people with money should around class. And I think whenever you're a member of a dominant group, it's really good advice to sit down and figure out, like, how did that identity shape my experience, for good, for bad, for other, right? How did it bring me to the place I am? Because the minute that I did that when I was in my early 20s, mid-20s, and I was encouraged to do so by activists of color in New Orleans, who were some of my dearest mentors, and they said, like, you need to take inventory of your life. And I didn't really understand that. To me, that seemed like just some intellectual exercise. And they're like, no, you just need to, like, because what they did is they said, why do you care about this? That was their question to me. And my answer was appropriately liberal, right? It was something real nice, like, oh, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And they're like, yeah, that line has already been used, so you need to pick a different one, right? And so then they said, you just need to sit down and think about it. Like, why does this matter to you so much? And when I actually sat down and I took inventory and I thought about my life all the way back to childhood and all the ways that race had shaped who I had become, then it became really obvious to me that I was implicated in this thing. And it didn't make me feel guilty because I wasn't to blame for any of it, but it pissed me off. It was like, damn it, like, I'm not a control freak, but the one thing I would like to sort of control is my own story. Like, that would be cool. I'd like to write my own script, thank you. And I wasn't. My script was being written by historical circumstance. And so once I realized that, and I had 10, 15 pages of stuff in front of me, because I had done this exercise that folks had told me to do, then all of a sudden things started leaping off the page to me about what I could do next time, right? Things about how I could interact in the community and how I could take action and how I could respond when something happened, or how I could preempt something and keep it from happening. Like, all of a sudden, once it was on the paper, then the possibilities became limitless. But until I had taken inventory, I didn't know what to do. I was like, I don't know where to start. Once I did that, I started to figure it out. So I would encourage people to do that. Really think about the way that your life has been racialized. And if you're one of those people who says, I've never really experienced race, well, that's your experience with race, right? If you've never really had to think about it, if you've never really given any thought to how whiteness affected you, then that's probably the more evidence that it has, because it's pulled that sort of cloak over your eyes, that veil over your eyes, and that's the more reason to interrogate it. So I think people can begin to do that, and people of color just have to keep shining the light and leading the way, which they've always done, and really demonstrating, serving as sort of bullshit detectors and truth barometers for the culture. Because that's what people of color have always had to do. They've always had to people of color have always had to interpret America for white people and really understand and make us understand what it was. And it's a damn shame that people of color have to spend so much time trying to teach white people stuff that we ought to be able to see with our own eyes. But at the very least, when folks of color stand up and express their truth, and you have to find, safe spaces to do that, because I realize sometimes it's not safe, but I think that role is critically important. And whether or not white folks ever listen to it, it's important to speak that truth. What I see in the last couple of years since Trayvon Martin, and what I see certainly with the BLM folks, is that they are insistent that we are going to tell our truth, and we're not really going to care whether you want to hear it or not. And that's incredibly bold and incredibly empowering and incredibly important. They're not wrapped up in all the respectability politics that have sort of sidelined us for a lot of years. And I know there are some older heads in the struggle that are very uncomfortable with that, who feel like, you need to dress a certain way and you need to speak a certain way, and you can't sag your pants and you can't listen to this music, and you got to wear, you can't wear a ball cap, you got to wear a suit and tie, that way they'll respect you. It's all this respectability politics stuff that has been real prominent for a couple decades now. But let's not forget, John Lewis was in a suit and tie when they beat his ass bloody on the bridge in Selma. And Dr. King was wearing a suit and tie when his brains were blown out on the 3rd floor of the Lorraine Motel. So the idea that you can just dress nice and talk nice and be polite and erudite and affable and somehow white supremacy won't come for you, that's just not real. So these young people are saying, well, we're not going to play by your rules. We're going to demand that we're respected. We're also going to demand, which is incredible, that we have an intersectional analysis that connects race with gender and sexuality and class. That's critical. When is the last time that a movement really did that? It's very rare. So all of a sudden you've got these young activists who are seeing the connections, and they're not only speaking out about, you know, black male lives, which would have been the operative sort of understanding maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and for some people, sadly, it still is, but they're also talking about women, they're talking about trans folk, they're talking about working class folk, right? This is how movements are built, by really insisting that we're going to focus on all the different elements of these communities that are being marginalized and oppressed. So I think it's incredibly inspiring. People of color doing amazing leadership work, and there are white folks who, if we are prepared to follow that and listen to that and trust that we have a role to play as allies in solidarity, we can make quite a difference. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Other questions over here? Anyone?
Hi. I don't know how much Lucy and Emmeline told you about RISD culture, but a lot of us really, or the vast majority of us really overinvest ourselves in our studies, and we make a lot of excuses about putting all our effort into our studios. And so I think one of our most significant issues here is that we have people who are interested in participating in these discussions and participating in social justice activism.
Right.
But we think we're too busy for it. And so do you have any recommendations for people who think they don't have time, but they still want to participate?
Absolutely. My biggest recommendation is don't assume that activism is just this thing that you do outside of the classroom. Like, your art is your activism, right? Like, what you do as nobody's keeping you from making your art socially relevant, making the work that you do in the classroom. So no one is telling you that you can't do that. No one is telling you that you can't take on these issues. So, you know, I think sometimes we make the mistake, not just students at a place like RISD, this is common anywhere, which is like, oh, I'm studying and I've got, 20 hours a semester or whatever it is, or 20 units, and I've got all this hours in a week that I've got to study, and then maybe I hold down a part-time job also to help me pay for the school, and how am I going to do activism? And by that I mean, how am I going to go to the march or the demonstration, or how am I going to go to all these meetings? Screw that. Like, if you can't, I'm not saying don't go to that, but that's not, put that aside for a second. If you can't do that, you can't do that. But I got to tell you, I think that artists are in a position to do some of the most important work in this or any other society about changing our perceptions as a people about where we are. It's fine for me to get up and speak, and that's a form of art, I suppose. And my writing is a form of art, I suppose. But really and truly, when you think about all the types of art, I mean, I didn't see everything on campus today, but I had a great tour, other than the part where we had to climb the hill. That sucked. Lucy's like, doop-a-doop-a-doo, I do this every day, and I'm 47. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna have a heart attack right here, and my asthma is kicking in, and I'm gonna hyperventilate. This is awful. But other than that, it was great. But she showed me enough to where I saw like really serious artists doing really serious stuff in a multitude of mediums, and there's no reason that you can't bring a certain degree, even a significant degree of social consciousness and consciousness around issues of racial equity to your day-to-day work. Like, make that your activism. Nothing wrong with that, because then when you get out there and you're a working artist, and that's, if that's what you're going to end up doing, and you're going to go out there and you're going to do this amazing stuff, that needs to be blended with a message. Because I think sometimes we have this sort of not content-free art. All art has content, but we have this art that isn't necessarily speaking to our condition. And right now, our condition is in desperate need of artists. Whether that's poets, whether that's painters, whether that's musicians, whether that's dancers, whether that's photographers, whether that's illustrators, whether that's all the stuff that y'all do here, all of that stuff can be infused with an awareness. And so I would start right where you are. Don't look at how you can go outside of your existing work. Like, make that work relevant and make it something that's meaningful and aimed towards social change. And then you're knocking off both of those things. right? With one, killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. You're doing both things, and then after you're out, then you can figure it out. Maybe you will have time to go to meetings and demonstrations, and that's great too. But don't feel like that's all that activism is. I think we've created this definition of activism that's really limiting, and then people feel bad when they can't do that. All my mom ever did, and I'm putting that in quote marks, all she ever did was raise me the way that she raised me. She wasn't an activist. She didn't go to meetings. She didn't go to demonstrations. All she did was raise me this way. And by God, that was enough, right? Like sometimes you just do these little things. Everybody bites off a little piece of it, and we actually get somewhere instead of beating ourselves up about the fact we're not doing everything. Or we're only doing, 2 things and we want to do 5. Screw that, do 2 and get somebody else to do the other 2 and somebody else does 1 and then we got all 5 go, I think that sometimes we make it harder than we have to make it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't have to be that hard, Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm going to go right after her because our questions are very related.
Okay.
I wanted to talk about RISD as an institution and our role in, as you're saying, the visual artists, our role being socially conscious and holding RISD accountable to making sure that students are socially conscious. Because earlier in your talk, you were talking about how in art, we focus on European art, we focus on Greco-Roman, this and that, and we forget about these other continents, like Africa, this giant continent where there's a crap ton of artwork that we don't talk about as a mandatory part of our classes.
Right.
Yes. So how can we hold RISD responsible as an institution to making sure that our students are conscious of the fact that the work that they create has an influence? Because we don't have required courses. We don't talk about race in class unless someone like me or Mariah or another student decides to bring it up.
Right.
So how do we make sure that RISD does that?
Well, I think we have to have these real conversations here and at every institution about what it means to be a competent artist or student or anything, scholar, in the 21st century. And as I said a couple of times today in earlier sessions, to be a competent scholar, or in the sense of RISD, to be a competent artist in whatever medium in the 21st century in this country means something very different than it did 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and 100 years ago. I see the thing, so school's been around since 1877. In 1877 and even 1977, you could be sort of oblivious to this stuff and still be a competent artist in the sense of, you could make your way in the world. It was still a really white-dominated country, demographically and culturally. 1977, you could be deemed relevant and competent and relatively scholarly. But I would say, here we are almost, 40 years later, and that's not true. And so part of it is redefining excellence, redefining merit, redefining what it means to be qualified, right? Redefining what it means to be a scholar or an artist or anything else, and having the school inculcate that mentality from the very first day that students step on the campus, which is to say that we're going to expect that you will engage with multiple traditions, and that even when you engage with one tradition, you will engage it from multiple perspectives. Because even if we're studying sort of the Western canon of art or literature or history or anything else, there are different ways of looking at that canon. There are different ways of looking at even that which we consider very traditional and Western that are based on the gaze of and the eyes of and the lens of and the frame of the person doing the looking. And so part of being a good scholar in 2015 is knowing, what does that mean? I said the story a couple times today, but I'll say it again. I was in Beloit, Wisconsin the other day, and we were having this conversation about faculty hiring, and I was saying, look, if you're looking to hire a Shakespeare scholar for your English Lit department, and that Shakespeare scholar that you end up hiring doesn't have an awareness of, and I mean not just a fleeting awareness, but like a deep understanding of feminist critiques of Shakespearean literature, or radical multicultural critiques of Shakespearean literature, both of which have been around for more than a minute, then that person is not a competent Shakespeare scholar anymore. You were a great Shakespeare scholar in 1647, or maybe even 1947, but now you are incompetent. You are not qualified to teach Shakespeare if you teach it the way you would have 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago. And the same is true of any of the disciplines that you're studying right now, because they all have got different ways of being looked at and different ways of being understood. So I feel like the institution has to encourage us to know that and require us to know that. So that when we are doing work in whatever medium and whatever tradition, that we're still able to look at it from multiple perspectives. In a sense, I guess what I'm saying is that schools like RISD, in order to be accountable to this truth, have to sort of take away the option of opting out of this conversation. Right? They have to remove the option, because right now, that's the option, is I can opt in by taking certain classes, I can opt in by taking certain classes maybe at Brown that'll help fulfill certain requirements that might really delve into this stuff really heavy, or I can take certain classes here, but then I can also opt out, and I can just say, I don't want to talk about any of that race, gender, and sexuality stuff and class stuff if I don't want to. And the fact that I can actually do that, the fact that I can actually finish college in 2015 in the United States, anywhere, and not have to engage those issues is criminal. Nobody would let me do that and like opt out of certain basic classes that are expected of everyone at most every institution, but somehow I can be ignorant to this stuff and still be thought of as competent. I don't get it. So I think schools have to basically remove the option of obliviousness, because otherwise we'll default to that. And I think if they remove that option by expecting certain things and selecting students and faculty and staff and administrators on the basis of their willingness to engage this, and maybe even their experience engaging it when it comes to faculty, right? In other words, when we're hiring faculty, it's about saying, you know, the most qualified person might have 2 years less experience, but they might have experience in this particular area. So now they actually might be more qualified than the person with 2 years more experience, but who's never talked about this stuff ever. Right? What are we looking for? What are we choosing for? What are we selecting for? How are we defining merit? And I think, you know, those are the conversations that the school has to have if they really want to move in any substantive way. Thank you very much. A couple more real quick, and then I'll let you get out of here.
Are there make a legal comment about how like it's not regarding like discrimination, it's not just white versus black, but like you did a statement that the racial history of discrimination is about white people encouraging working class people to blame black people for their problems. And it took me back, and so obviously there's an economic underlying to all of this. So it took me back to the summer, this past summer, where the Black Lives Movement in terms of Bernie Sanders. At the time, everyone was like, why are they doing that? Because Bernie Sanders has done a lot of stuff regarding the black community. And their critique was that Bernie said, like, even despite all his work,
Right.
he's also deafness to like what he does because
Right.
you know, economic inequality doesn't solve everything.
Right.
And he wasn't hearing that even though he does mean well. So how do you, can you please clarify the like relationship between the discrimination and like racism, also like economic inequality?
Sure. Well, my new book, which unfortunately I did run out of copies, or I would totally sell all of you a copy of it, but I just don't have any, actually talks about that. And that's actually the whole point of the new book, is to explore the relationship between class inequality and the particular hostility toward poor and working class folks and race and racism historically and today. Because I think those two things are very much connected. I think the biggest mistake that Bernie Sanders, and not so much Bernie Sanders as much as his supporters, it's not so much him, because he has shown himself, when he is challenged, willing to move. Like, I mean, he moved after BLM interrupted him, not once but twice, and that says something. I mean, he immediately got on the stick and started doing stuff about, you know, criminal justice reform. Now, I think he could have gone farther in some other areas, but, you know, the biggest problem has been his supporters, who are, you know, sort of don't come out of a racial justice frame, most of the white supporters. They come out of a, you know, they've been environmental activists, anti-war activists, they've been, you know, anti-national security state activists, I mean, all of which are very important issues, but if you come out of that lens and come out of that frame, and then you're interrupted by people of color, you do sort of default to this, but Bernie Sanders got arrested in the civil rights movement. What the hell does that matter? That was 1962. Right? Like, I mean, honestly, if the last war that Bernie Sanders opposed was Vietnam, none of these people would be praising him. Right? It's precisely because he's also been opposed to recent wars that nice white lefties love him. If the last war he opposed publicly was the Vietnam War, nobody'd be saying, but he opposed the Vietnam War. We'd be asking about, well, what about Afghanistan? What about Iraq? What about Grenada? What about Nicaragua? What about El Salvador? What about, you know? Now, he's opposed all those too, which is great, but that's the point. You got to focus on what's been happening lately. And Bernie Sanders, you know, maybe it's because he's from Vermont, and he was the mayor of Burlington for a long time, and he's a senator from there. He's from Brooklyn originally, but he's been away from Brooklyn for a long time. Vermont's really white, you know? And so he doesn't have to think about race every day. So I get it. I totally understand it. But what I wish he would do is I wish he would talk about this history and this connection, because if you really look, and I alluded to it in the speech, if you really look at the history of the class system in the U.S., it's very different than the class system in any other country that we like to compare ourselves to. Every feudal monarchy of Europe was a very clearly divided class system. You had the peasants and you had the elite, and that was it. And when you were one, you knew you were one, and you were never going to be the other. And so there was never any belief that you would somehow just work really hard and you would no longer be a peasant. In this country, we've got like a perfect class system, and I mean that in a bad way, like a perfectly self-sustaining class system, because we actually tell people, if you just double down on your work effort, you'll actually be the king one day. Oh, really? Okay, cool. Then I'll just work much harder and everything will be fine. So, and what we've done historically to keep people divided against one another is we've done that thing that we've done with race that Trump is doing now, which is, you know, in the colonies, rich white people telling landless peasants, many of them indentured servants, that, hey, we're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those black folks in line, right? You still don't really have power. You still don't have any money. You still aren't rich. They still don't like you, but now you got a little bit of authority, right? It's like getting a badge, and it's like you're a deputy sheriff. No, you're not. You're just a poor white schmuck that they're, you know, whose ass they're kicking every day, but they made you believe that you actually were something, right? And then you see it in the union movement. You saw, you know, white labor unions that wouldn't bring black folks or Mexican labor or Chinese labor into the union. And they would say why. They would openly articulate, well, if we bring them in, it'll reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, it'll double the size of your union. That's what it'll do. And then when your union is stronger and you've got people of color on strike with you, the boss can't turn around and hire the brown folk as replacement workers to take your job, because they're already on strike with you. But when you don't bring them into the union, guess who they're going to use to break your strike? Brown people. And then you're going to beat them up and burn down their neighborhood. I mean, that's like what was done. There's always been this trick. Whiteness was a trick played on poor European people to convince them to be more afraid of brown folk and black folk than rich white folk. So you can't unwind the American class system without understanding race, because if you're trying to organize class-based movements for economic justice and you don't deal with this elephant in the room, which is how white folks have been propagandized to ignore our class interest on behalf of our caste interest, then you can't possibly build coalitions, because those white folks will actually say, like, I know, I don't have anything, but at least I got more than them. I mean, we saw that in Louisiana. The very first work that I did was against David Duke, this white supremacist neo-Nazi former Klan leader running for the U.S. Senate. And you had working class white folks voting for this guy, even though he offered them no plan for economic development or jobs. All he wanted to do, he just promised he was going to crack down on black welfare cheats and affirmative action and immigrants. He was just going to kick all their asses. And then these working class white folks without a pot to piss in were like, well, all righty then. We'll vote for him. And he got 60% of the white vote, almost none of them affluent rich folks. Not because the affluent rich folks didn't agree with Duke. They agreed with his politics, but they sort of knew better than to vote for him, right? But all the working class folks were like, well, goddamn, yeah, we'll do that. And then you look at what happened in Katrina, and you see, you know, I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. I was gone well in advance of Katrina, but you know, when that happened, the two hardest hit communities in the New Orleans area were the lower Ninth Ward, which is on the Orleans Parish side, black community, 95%, about 40% poor, and the community of Chalmette in St. Bernard Parish, right across the road basically from the lower Ninth, 95% white, also working class. Those were the two hardest hit communities because the canal flooded, because the levees weren't constructed adequately. And so you had this white community and this black community, both working class, that lost all their stuff. Why? Because elites didn't feel the need to protect them. Why? Because they had no political clout, because they're all working class people. So, but here's the thing. Do you think the white folks in Chalmette actually realized, oh my God, like I have a joint interest with these black people. I should probably join with them to fight the Corps of Engineers, to fight the elites that made these budgetary decisions? No. They sat there and pointed across the way, and then as soon as people started moving back to New Orleans, St. Bernard Parish gets into session, and one of the very first things they do within a few months is they pass a new law called the Blood Relative Renter Law that was basically about saying you can't rent in St. Bernard Parish unless you are renting from a relative. Well, what do you think the purpose of that was? In a 95% white parish, that was about making sure that when people came back to the parish, black folks wouldn't come. So they're still fighting black people, like black people, the ones that flooded their stuff and jacked their stuff. But it wasn't people of color, right? It was rich white folks. So and 67% of those folks in Chalmette voted for David Duke, the Nazi, when he ran for governor in 1991. 2/3, almost 70%, right? So that to me is the whole history. And unless we're prepared to confront that and confront how race has been used to drive a wedge between people whose interests are really very similar, then we're never going to get anywhere. And we may still not get anywhere, but I think we have to at least try by engaging that narrative rather than allowing the elites to manipulate people on the basis of their caste identity rather than their class identity. Yes.
I respect and appreciate your work, and thank you for being here. And especially like your comments about borders being imaginary constructs. And this may seem like a basic or pedantic question, but I hope we'll see what it's where I'm coming from. I'm asking sincerely. And you clarify. Could you define race, or could you speak to how important it is in your work to distinguish race from nationality or culture, etc.?
Sure. Race is this made-up thing that white people invented. I should say people called white. Invented, because if I say white people, I'm actually acting like they're real, right? Race is this made-up thing created by Europeans, people of European descent, solely for the purpose of delineating up and down who would have and who would not, and using science or pseudoscience to justify what they were already doing on the ground, right? So it's basically an after-the-fact rationalization for existing inequalities that have been perpetrated by public policy. What I mean by that is that it has no scientific meaning, no biological meaning. We have 30,000 genes in the human genome, 6 of which, roughly, control the physical features that we use to define race: skin color, hair texture, facial features. 6 out of 30,000 control those, and they have no known concordance, which is just a fancy scientific word for interrelationship, with any other important human traits. They have no known connection to morality, no known connection to decency, no known connection to honesty, integrity, intelligence, physical prowess or lack thereof, criminality or deviance. You know, the things that actually make us certain quote-unquote races, at least how we think of race, have no relationship to any important human trait. And all the stuff that is related to any important human trait doesn't cluster by so-called race. So race is essentially a fiction. Nationality, on the other hand, is quite real, although, you know, the borders are still artificial. I mean, the borders of the United States are artificial, and the borders of European countries are ever shifting. And so even that, everything's sort of a social construct, right? I mean, in the sense that we construct the meaning of nationality, we construct the meaning of ethnicity, and it changes. We construct the meaning of race. So nothing is really fixed. But I think what makes race such a dangerous notion, because there's always been ethnocentrism, right? There's always been, probably ever since human beings came in contact with other human beings who were from different tribes, different nations, not nations, but different places, different communities, and especially if they look different, I'm quite sure that there's always been sort of a tendency to divide into in-group, out-group. That would make sense, like as an evolutionary perspective. We would create in-groups and out-groups. And if I'm in my little tribe over here, and then we crawl over the mountain, and all of a sudden we see you, and you see us, and it's like, oh shit, now we're competing for resources, so we're gonna create in-group and out-group. But what's interesting is that race, by which we normally mean things like skin color, hair texture, facial features, physical outward manifestations of phenotypic difference, are things that had very little relevance until the modern era, at least a few hundred years ago. So like if you go back and look at the ancient Greeks and you look at what Herodotus, who's considered to be the father of history, at least by people in the Eurocentric tradition, which is a whole nother conversation. But what Herodotus said was very clear. He actually had great respect for Africans. Said amazing, laudatory things about African kingdoms with which he had direct contact in that pre-modern era. He had horrible things to say about Europeans. Herodotus thought Europeans were slow and dim-witted and warlike and didn't want to work, they just wanted to kill each other, right? thought Europeans were absolutely the basest of humanity. Of course, the Greeks thought that the Greeks were better than everybody. By definition, everybody that wasn't Greek was just awful. But it wasn't based on color. Herodotus didn't think that the Greeks were better because of their skin coloration or their facial features or their hair texture. He thought they were better because they were this cultural, they're culturally superior. Color only became relevant, what we now think of as race, only became relevant really to any significant degree in the 1600s and after, and specifically in the colonies of what would become the United States. We created race as such. Other countries had ethnocentrism, other countries had nationalism, other countries had various forms of discrimination. Right now in Japan, the treatment of the Baraku caste, for instance, or ethnic Koreans in Japan who were brought in and used as essentially slave labor, that's an obvious example of ethnic discrimination. And it's been increasingly racialized so that now, after many generations of that, there are people in Japan who actually do perceive the Baraku as virtually a different race, but that was something that's a construct that they've picked up really from us. The same way that if you look at sub-Saharan African nations in the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years, you'll hear stories in the news of black women from sub-Saharan African nations bleaching their skin with incredibly dangerous chemicals and dying from these chemicals because they're trying to lighten themselves. That didn't happen 500 years ago. That didn't happen 300 years ago. Definitely didn't happen 2,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a recent construct. So race is this fiction that we have created and transported that is especially dangerous because it's rooted in the notion of inelasticity. It's rooted in the notion of impermeability, this idea that once you're a member of race X, you can never be with race Y or be part of a community that's run by race Y or A versus B, and you're inherently inferior. There's something that's immutable about the characteristic, whereas culture is fluid, right? Culture is fluid. I can become a part of a culture and take on the trappings of the culture, or religion is fluid, right? One of the reasons that in the colonies and in the slave system of the United States, they ended up shifting to a race-based mentality, because early on, if you look at the literature, it was all about like like when Europeans go to Africa and begin to colonize and take human beings as property, they're not talking about color necessarily, except insofar as they viewed dark skin as a religious curse, right? Because there was this interpretation of Genesis as this curse of Ham, right? So that the Hamitic curse that was placed upon the descendants of Ham, who were then perceived as black, even though that's not what the Bible said, but it was this religious ideology. It wasn't really about racial inferiority or science. It was about God and who's a good Christian and who's not. But the problem was, once you took people as slaves and then you bring them to a country where you then Christianize them, and now they go to church, and now they take the same sacraments that you take, and now they say the same prayers that you take, and now if I'm trying to subordinate you and my religion says that I'm supposed to treat all as children of God, and I've taught you the religion, and now you know it as well as I do, if not better, then I'm screwed. It's like, wait a minute, I can't keep screwing you if you're a Christian. I gotta be. So then all of a sudden I gotta come up with a new theory. So religion and culture were never gonna be like impermeable enough to serve the needs of people who wanted to oppress. They needed something more, and skin color and nation of ancestry became that. So that if I can say you're black because you're from Africa, doesn't matter how light you are. If your ancestors are from Africa, then by God, you're black. If you have one drop of black blood, if you're 1/16th, 1/32nd, different states had different standards, then we're gonna mark you. And so that made it especially dangerous, but it was never science. It was always constructed for the needs of the elite. Because obviously, you can't be 1/16th black in one state and 1/32nd in another and have both mean the same thing. If I'm black in Mississippi, how am I not black in Alabama? How am I not black in South Carolina? How am I not black in Florida if I'm black in Georgia, right? I mean, it's sort of, the whole thing is absurd. But that's really the difference, is that race was a much more closed circle than nationality or ethnicity or culture or religion, all of which were more permeable and more fluid. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. So I also appreciate you speaking to us today and agree with you on many things. But I come from a lineage of the 1% and the financial class, and often when I try and bring up these issues with my family or peers, I find that they're ignorant by choice and not by anything I say is not going to change it. So how do you combat chosen ignorance?
I think you have to pick those battles very carefully, not so much because you should be intimidated from bringing them to such people, but just because for your own mental and emotional well-being, it pays to not beat your head against a wall. So I think sometimes we conceive of our role incorrectly. It goes back to what I said about artists not having, it's like bring your work to your art. You don't have to do extra stuff, just bring your work to your art. I think the same is true here. We conceive of our role sometimes, those of us who think, that we've got some enlightenment and we've got some important stuff to share. We conceive of our role as converting the heathen, right? I mean, essentially, we're conversion machines. We're like evangelical radicals, right? So we're going to go out and evangelize the heathens, and we're going to get them to see the error of their ways, either the class errors or the racial errors or whatever it is. And sometimes that works. If you have enough time to spend with someone, and particularly if you have some relationship with them and some investment in them and they have some investment in you, then maybe over time, you break down certain barriers. I've certainly seen it happen. But I think the mistake is thinking that that's our job, and I think it's not. I think that by and large, our job is not converting the heathen or evangelizing to the heathen, so to speak, about these issues of justice and race and class. I think it's about mobilizing our side, right? Because if you really think about the far right in this country, the far right did not take power when Ronald Reagan came to office because the majority of Americans loved Ronald Reagan or thought he'd be a good president. Like, the majority of Americans didn't vote in the 1980 election, didn't vote in the 1984 election, didn't vote in any election, right? So the idea that the popular will has really been expressed in any election that's happened in any of your lifetimes is just absurd, right? We don't really know what the majority of people believe because the majority of people are not mobilized, whether it's for partisan politics or activism or anything else. So the right took power not because most people agreed with them. The surveys actually showed that most people didn't, right? But they took power because their people were more active than ours, those of us on the left. I mean, when Barry Goldwater got trounced in 1964, the one thing that the right understood that I think the left still hasn't figured out is they decided we'll sit and lick our wounds in the political wilderness for the next decade and a half, and we will not, they didn't spend all that time coming up with policy proposals and facts and data and research that they would then take to the people, and the people would go, oh my God, trickle-down economics is the greatest thing ever. Like, that didn't happen, right? They just created a storyline. They created a narrative, and the story was about welfare queens that were taking people's money, and the story was about how if you just gave tax breaks to rich people, they could create jobs and do great stuff. These were narratives. They were just fiction. They were stories, but they worked really, really well because they spoke to emotional needs. And then the rest of us, I think sometimes liberals, the problem with liberals, and there's different problems with liberals and leftists, right? I'm more of a leftist than a liberal, but the problem with liberals is liberals have this unhealthy faith in the power of pure reason. Liberals actually think that reason matters. Now, it ought to matter, but if you think it does, you ain't been paying attention. Reason is not what directs politics. All the psych research, actually, social psychology research, says that people don't make political decisions on the basis of logic or reason. We make them on the basis of caprice. We make them on the basis of emotion. All of us do, right, left, or center. We make decisions not on the basis of logic. In fact, if you have a belief in something and somebody shows you evidence that contradicts your belief, the evidence actually says that you dig in harder, right? That you're less likely to believe them. So if I'm wasting my time trying to convert right-wingers to not be classist and bash people in the bottom, odds are pretty good I'm going to be frustrated. If, on the other hand, I'm focusing on taking all those people who say they're about something and say that they're down for the fight and figuring out how we're going to mobilize us, then we can out-mobilize the other side. We out-organize the other side. Back in 1988, Ralph Reed, who was the head of the Christian Coalition at that time, which now is sort of a non-issue or non-organization. I don't think they exist anymore, but it was Pat Robertson's group, and then Ralph Reed took it over. And he famously made the comment that they didn't need 50% of the American population to be on their side. They only needed about 6%. Because if they had 6% really mobilized, going to the polls, making decisions, voting and organizing, then everybody else would be at home watching Falcon Crest. This was in the 80s. That's why that, for those of you a little too young to remember that, what the hell is that? It'd be like saying most people will be watching So You Think You Can Dance. Most people will be watching, Duck Dynasty or whatever the hell that is, or, Storage Wars or Hillbilly Hand Fishing or whatever the hell, Most people will be watching Netflix reruns. They'll be watching watching, some, episode of some show that they love. And so really it might be as simple as getting your people out there and active. And I don't mean necessarily for elections, right? But I mean for the movement stuff that we're talking about. So by all means, hey, if you're feeling powerful enough one day to have a conversation with folks in that 1% or 1/10 of 1% and challenge them because you got nothing better to do, and your blood pressure is not high enough as it is, hey, go do that shit. Like, that's great. By all means, somebody's got to do it. But I do believe that in the long run, it's really more about mobilizing our people rather than trying to change them. They'll either come around or they won't. But most everybody I know that ever came around on this stuff, they didn't come around because of a talk of mine or a book they read or an article they read or a meme they saw on the internet. They came around because they had some experience, and it was usually intensely personal, right? And you can't give that to them. That just has to come. That's karma, that's serendipity, that's luck, that's fate. As a guy that I met back in January of last year, Arno Michaelis, who's a former skinhead, and Arno talks about when he finally left that movement, nothing was going to change him. He knew who I was. He knew that, his people wanted to kill me and everybody liked me. Nothing that I ever said was going to change him. But he said one day he goes into a McDonald's, I think it was. And the story is, as I recall, that he, was giving the money to the woman behind the counter who was a black woman. And here's this big guy, big, like 6'4", whatever, muscular guy. And he's got a swastika tattoo like on his hand or right on his wrist or something. And he's handing her the money, and she takes the money from him, sees his tattoo, looks him in the eye and says, "Son, you're better than that," right? And it was this moment, right, that I couldn't have given him, no argument could have given him, but it was this moment of grace that was extended to him by this woman who didn't owe him that. It's for damn sure. She didn't owe him that. But she, in that moment, extended that to him, and it flipped a switch in his brain where it was like, holy crap, Like, she has every reason to hate me, to fear me, and she doesn't. In fact, she actually believes in me more than I believe in myself. What does that mean, right? Which is, on the one hand, it's crazy, right, that folks of color are always extending grace to white people. Right? It's like after Charleston, when all those folks who were the family of the victims of that shooting that, like, forgave Dylan Roof, like that's both incredibly powerful and incredibly nauseating at the same time, because it's like, why? Now, on the one hand, I get it. I understand restorative justice enough to know that at some point you got to forgive those who do wrong to you, because otherwise it'll eat you up. But man, it's interesting, isn't it? How forgiving people of color have been to white folks over the years. I said, and this is totally off the subject of your question, but I want to just say it because I said this the other day on social media and I got some flack for it, but I stand by it and I always will. Like, I'm having a hard time figuring out whether white folks really, at our core, value black life as equal. And here's why I'm having a hard time with that. Like, so let's say, and this goes back to this issue of grace and forgiveness. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I come from a family that included slaveholders. It also included abolitionists. So I've got both good and bad, right? I'm only standing here today alive because black folks didn't kill my ancestors who held them in bondage. And make no mistake, had they done so, and I'm going to be very clear about this, there would have been nothing morally objectionable about that. Now let me explain what I mean. If my children were kidnapped tomorrow and held against their will, I would sure as hell never judge them for slitting the throat of their captor if given the chance. And I don't think any of you would either. Those women that were held by Ariel Castro in Columbus, Ohio, wherever it was, for 10 years and finally were able to escape. If they had killed Ariel Castro, would any of you object to that? Would any of you said, oh no, you really should have petitioned him nonviolently to let you out of the house? Like, no. Anyone who's kidnapped and held against their will, who kills their captor, we would never prosecute them. We would understand that if it happened to us or our kid, we would applaud it and we would want for that. And yet, if I say that those who were enslaved on these shores had the moral right to kill their owners without hesitation or the least bit of mercy, people teed off on me on social media like, well, the Quakers were very nonviolent. I'm like, the hell does that, you tell me the Quakers don't believe in self-defense? Because I don't believe that that's true. I know plenty of Quakers who in that moment would not be against self-defense, but what does that even mean? You're telling me that a Quaker, once their kid was kidnapped, to be like, well, I hope they stay true to the principles of the church. No, that's bullshit. Like, if your kid was kidnapped, you would want them to get free by any means necessary. So the only reason that we are here, many of us who come from a background of slaveholding, the only reason that people in this, which was the most profitable slave center in the United States for a very long time, are alive today is because black folks had more forbearance and more forgiveness and more decency than was extended to them. And so it's just sort of fascinating to me, like, that's been the whole history of and that's not about like, oh my God, thank you for not killing me, oh my God, like, I'm not feeling bad or guilty or crappy about it. I'm just saying, like, think about what that means. You know, people get sucked into bad systems and do evil stuff all the time and never question it, because it just sort of is the inertia of a lot of history. And so I think that that has no relationship to your question. I just felt like saying it because I just think it's one of those things we really ought to think about. We're not going to change people that are that dug in, but we can, by virtue of the example that we demonstrate and the effort that we make, at least challenge some of their assumptions and some of their conditioning, and maybe bring us to a different place if we do it long enough. You know. Yes. One more, and then I'll let you all get out of here. Thanks.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask about how can we fight against band-aid activism? If we understand what's actually like white feminism, like maybe white feminism itself, like just focusing on these like minimal issues that just like kind of cover things over, with not really focusing on the deep issues such as like people like, oh, legalizing marijuana, yay, but not really talking about prison reform.
Right.
Or white feminism talking about, oh, we need to law, we need to be able to dress whatever we want, not talking about trans women, trans
Right.
women,
Right.
color. So it's just like, how do we, because if we say like, no, we shouldn't do that, then we're like, wait, this is important. How do you tell them like, there's something more important without?
Right. Well, the good news is, I mean, this is sort of the one thing I do think that is really important, is that, like I said before, I do think that these conversations, this pushback against Band-Aid, or what we used to call, when I was in college, we called it bikini liberalism, right? It was just enough liberalism to cover up the socially unacceptable parts, right? And so the pushback now, I mean, think about, like, white feminism is a thing. It's always been a thing, but it's a thing now that's being problematized in mainstream discussion, so much so that you have like major pop culture stars and actresses that are being like forced to confront that and talk about that, and entertainers that are being asked about white feminism. Like, think about, that's deep. Like, that conversation wasn't happening 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, even though there were womenist scholars and black and brown feminist scholars that were critiquing white feminism forever, right? I mean, this isn't new, but the critiques of those women of color usually fell on very deaf ears on the part of white feminists. So now white feminism is being sort of put back on its heels, right? And that's important. Or that class-based organizing that Bernie Sanders is all about, that sort of old school Marxist or pseudo-socialist analysis that sometimes gives short shrift to race, is being knocked back on its heels, which is really interesting. And that sort of male-centric, cisgendered approach to looking at issues of race is being pushed back on its heels. And so you do have folks in this struggle who are raising the issue of trans lives, and particularly within the context of black lives, and making clear that we have to have that conversation, not just a generic conversation about black life, but really calling out the specificity of how different black lives are endangered, or different brown lives are endangered, or different lives generally are endangered. And so I gotta say, like, that's really inspiring to me to see that. And that's all been within the last year or two. I mean, honestly, it's been exponential, the way that even the term cisgendered, right, has become something people have actually heard. Now, I won't assume everybody in the room knows what that is, but I mean, essentially cisgender is an identity, is a term for when your biologically assigned sex and your gender identity are essentially in sync with one another, as opposed to transgender, where there's discontinuity between the assigned biology and your gender identity and how you personally express. But that's a term that 10 years ago, I don't remember very many people using, other than those in the trans community that were active on those issues. It certainly was an issue that most of us, even in the social justice community, were using. Now it's a term that people have sort of heard, and even if they don't know what it is, they've heard it, and we're talking about those things, and so that's pretty impressive. Now, the way we have to keep that going, and I think it's really been the huge contribution of scholars like Kim Crenshaw and others who really are responsible for, in many ways, for creating this notion of intersectionality and talking about this first in the legal profession, obviously, is where Kim, first sort of initiated the conversation around intersectionality. But now you see entire movements of people that are using the term intersectionality, and even if 90% of the people who hear that, like, what is that? Well, okay, that's all right. We can talk about what that is. We can talk about what that means to then have a conversation about how these various identities intersect in various moments, and how black women experience blackness differently than black men, and how trans men and women experience it very different than cisgendered folk, and how working class people of color experience it differently than affluent folks of color, et cetera. And so I think that keeping the focus on that and telling our unique stories, right? So it's important that we hear the stories of trans folk of color when they are out doing the work. It's important that we push back against narratives that erase that. I mean, think about the backlash just in the last, 3 or 4 months to this incredibly absurd film about Stonewall, right? I mean, think about this ridiculous film that has turned Stonewall into a rebellion of mostly cis white activists, when in fact, if you know the history of the Stonewall Rebellion, and you know the history of what was going on around the bar and all throughout that time, it was mostly trans women of color and or drag queens and or homeless white youth. There were certainly white folks involved, but they were not pretty like this guy who's playing the role. They were working class, they were street folk, they were homeless. So it was a working class rebellion led mostly by trans women of color and drag queens of color. What does it mean that we have got so much pushback against this film that's been released that it's tanked at the box office? Like think about it. If this was 10, 15 years ago, there would have been so much excitement just to have a story about Stonewall and about the origins of the struggle that maybe nobody would have pushed back. But now it's like, no, you're not going to tell that story. That's amazing. You're not going to be allowed to tell that story and make money off of this struggle by lying about what it was. So I got to say, I think in a way, all we need to do is continue to do what people are doing right now, which is insisting that there are multiple ways of looking at this work, and we can't look at them through this singular lens of straightness for sure, whiteness for sure, maleness for sure, cisgendered, identity, upper middle class or middle class status or affluence. And I think that's what people are doing right now, and we just want to continue that. We want to make sure that when we're talking about these issues that we're learning about the stories of folks who maybe we haven't heard as much about as we've heard about Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and John Crawford and some of the obvious folks who maybe have gotten more attention, who deserve all the attention they've gotten, but maybe we also need to be making sure that we're talking about other folks and we're investigating their stories and we're learning about them, and I think generally we don't do that. Generally our politicians don't do that, and our media doesn't frame it that way. And so, let's get out there and learn those stories and share those stories and really encourage one another to hold up all the different ways of doing this work from these different angles of identity. I think we're done. Is that it? Thank you all so much for being here.